All right, good afternoon, everyone. I think we're ready to get started. So glad to be here, glad to see everyone. This is, well, first of all, good afternoon. I'm Mayor Devin T. Murphy, and this is the Pinole City Council special meeting for Tuesday, April 25th, 2023 at 6 p.m. It's now called to order. The first item on the agenda is the Pledge of Allegiance. Please rise for the pledge.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. We'll move down to item number 2 on the agenda, which is our land acknowledgement. Before we begin, we would like to acknowledge the Ohlone people, who are the traditional custodians of this land. We pay our respects to the Ohlone elders, past, present, and future, who call this place Ohlone land, the land that Pinole sits upon, their home. We are proud to continue their tradition of coming together and growing as a community. We thank the Ohlone community for their stewardship and support, and we look forward to strengthening our ties as we continue our relationship of mutual respect and understanding. Thank you, and now we're on to item number 3 of the agenda, which is roll call and City Clerk's report. Good evening, Madam City Clerk, if you will.
Good evening, Mayor. Thank you. Mayor Murphy.
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Toms.
Here.
Councilmember Tave.
Here.
Councilmember Martinez-Rubin.
Here.
Councilmember Sassai.
Here.
City Manager Murray.
Here.
City Attorney Kasher.
Here.
Mayor and Council, the agenda was posted on Thursday, April 20th at 3:30 p.m. with all legally required notices. No written comments were received in advance of the meeting. Do the council members have any conflicts to report this evening? Seeing none, that concludes my report. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Madam City Clerk. That does bring us to item number 4, which is citizens to be heard. We'll move back to you and ask if there are any speakers this evening for the first section of citizens to be heard.
Thank you, Mayor. Looks like we don't have any in-person speakers. I'm going to check online. Yes, it looks like we have 2. The first is Cordell Hendler. Go ahead, Mr. Hendler. Looks like we don't have audio for Mr. Hindler. We'll come back. The next speaker is Maria Alegria. Okay, I'm seeing that the speakers are unmuted. I'm just going to check in with broadcast. Can you check the audio on the Zoom callers, please? Mayor, it looks like we're not receiving audio, so maybe we can come back to citizens to be heard. I'll check in with broadcast staff. Thank you.
Okay, sounds great. Thank you. Madam City Clerk, would you like to take a recess, or do you think we should continue on with the agenda?
Maybe a short recess to check in with PCTV?
Sure.
Yep.
We'll take a 3-minute or
Thank you.
5-minute recess.
Let's do 5 minutes.
5 minutes.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's bright in here. Does it feel bright?
It's the same to me.
Really?
Maybe it's because it's light outside.
I don't know. It says brighter in here.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. This is a just another reminder that we are currently in recess. Given our technical difficulties, we're going to extend our recess for 15 more minutes. We'll start our meeting at 6:30, and so everybody has 15 more minutes. And we just want to make sure the public knows that you may be logged out of the Zoom because we're restarting. And so what you'll do is just simply enter that Zoom link. Again, as if you were going to make that public comment, we just have to restart the system, and hopefully we'll get that back on track, and we'll start off with citizens to be heard when we get back at 6:30. Thank you.
two, three. Testing, testing, 1, 2, 3.
Alrighty, it is 6:30. We are back in session, and I believe we have fixed our tech issues. So we'll go back to item number 4, which is citizens to be heard. I go to our Madam City Clerk Bell. Do we have any speakers this evening for the first section?
Yes, thank you, Mayor. Cordell Hindler. Go ahead, sir.
Yeah, can you hear me okay, Heather?
We can hear you. Thank you.
Yeah, so good evening, Mayor Murphy, Council. My name is Pinole, and I am a concerned Richmond resident. So after watching the last meeting and after watching the last council meeting, I was very appalled that when Mr. Anthony spoke, whenever he calls in, it's like I feel that he's being cut off, and I feel that that is very disrespectful because to me, I have a 15-year-old nephew, and I'm trying to teach him, like to talk to, elected officials like yourself in a very respectful manner. I'm telling him, I say, Christopher, you have to, when you talk to the elected officials, you have to, use your words. And I feel that Mr. Anthony, he's absolutely correct, that he's being cut off. And I feel that's very uncalled for, one. And then number two, also at that meeting, what would make the meetings go a lot quicker if we can, hear from the public. The public should not have to wait until about 10 or 10:30 to get our voices heard. So hopefully the council will consider that, condensing the reports, that would be very helpful. And then finally, let's see, as far as for a future agenda goes, for the May 16th agenda, I would like to see the revisions of the norm of how the council meetings should be conducted, because the public should not have to wait till about 6:30 or 6:40 for the meetings to get started. And I said, that's not right. We've been sitting there waiting for God knows how long. So hopefully you would consider these matters before you. That's it.
Thank you. Our next commenter is Maria Alegria.
Can you hear me now?
We can hear you. Go ahead.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Good evening, Mr. Mayor and Honorable City Council. My public comment has to do with the Pinole Valley Road has turned into a speeding raceway. Please make Pinole Valley Road a safe traffic and pedestrian corridor. On April 23rd in the afternoon, I witnessed a speeding car lose control on Pinole Valley Road near Seamus. The individual involved was in a race and lost control of his car and almost hit me head on. Thank goodness no one was hurt. The result was that the city signpost on Potrero Court stopped the car from landing into someone's front yard. It is now laying on the sidewalk. We need to stop these scofflaws. Pinole Valley Road from Castro Ranch to San Pablo Avenue has become a raceway with little to no consequences to the scofflaws. Many residents in the valley also share my concern. I have encouraged them to reach out to the mayor and city manager. We are the eyes and ears of the community. Please help us facilitate an easier process so we can report these incidents to the city manager and police chief. Help us help our public safety officers keep our community safe from these scofflaws. This incident has been posted on Nextdoor, and apparently, according to Nextdoor's analytics, as of today, it has received over 2.7 thousand views. Please make our community safety a community priority. Thank you and have a good evening.
That concludes the public comments.
Thank you, Madam City Clerk, and thank you to the public commenters. We are closing the citizens to be heard section and going to item number 5, which is 2 items of new business that we have for this evening. And the first one is item 5A, which is our fiscal year 2023 to 2024 general fund baseline budget and preliminary council request for fiscal year 2023-2024 budget changes. We have Finance Director Ms. Guillory here tonight for a presentation, and please take it away. Good evening.
Good evening, Mayor. Thank you. Members of the council, city staff, and members of the public. I'm the city's finance director, Markeisha Guillory, and tonight I will be walking you through an overview of the general fund baseline budget for the fiscal year 2023-24. Next slide. Staff's recommendation is for the council to receive this report on the baseline budget and direct staff to make any adjustments, if you have any, and inform staff of any preliminary requests that you may have for potential addition and/or deletion in the fiscal year 2023-24 budget. Next slide. So the topics of discussion for this presentation will include an explanation of the purpose of the budget and the budget development process. We'll go through the city's budget policy and then walk through some of the details for the general fund baseline budget and then discuss next steps. Next slide. Next, please. So just to give some background information on the purpose of a budget and local government budget specifically is that it serves 4 main purposes. It serves as a policy document, so it sets the city council's policy for the fiscal year in terms of the goals and objectives for the year and how they will be funded. It's a financial plan in that it includes estimated funding sources and estimated expenditures that will be funded by those revenue sources. It's an operations guide, and that includes information on programs and services provided by the city, as well as capital improvement projects. And this is done at the detail level by department in the budget document, and it maps out what the city plans to do for the fiscal year. And then lastly, it's a communications device, so it pulls together comprehensive information on the city and provides that information to the reader of the budget, and which includes a very wide audience of readers and uses for the budget. Next slide. So the city goes through a multi-month budget development process that starts with our mid-year budget. So we start with the fiscal year 2022-23 mid-year budget, and that is our starting point for the baseline. From there, we add in known factors for our budget. So we first look at our ongoing revenues and ongoing expenditures, and then we make adjustments from there based on some known conditions, such as increases in certain expenditures, such as personnel costs. We also do some historical trend analysis to look at growth rates in our revenue sources. We also tap into other sources to use for our assumptions and growth rates year over year. We have a number of internal activities that we do, including each department reviewing their budgets and submitting requests for changes to their baseline budgets. And some of those includes proposals to increase positions and or appropriations. And at that time, we do meet with the individual departments, that being myself and the city manager, meets with each department to review budgets in detail and to prepare the baseline budget to see where we stand in terms of our recurring revenues and recurring expenditures. And from there, we begin to prepare the preliminary proposed budget for City Council's consideration. So the little graphic in the right-hand corner is something that I added just to show the various components and how they connect, because we use these various terms such as baseline budget and preliminary proposed budget as well. What does all of that mean, and how does those tie together? So for tonight, the baseline budget is our starting point. From there, we'll build upon that. So we'll have one-time expenses that may come from council-directed initiatives or department-recommended additions to the budget that may be one-time. We add those on top of the baseline budget, and then we also add in the capital improvement projects and the budget for those, and we come up with the preliminary proposed budget, which will be presented to the City Council at a meeting in May. Next slide. So some of the key dates that fall within the budget development process includes April 20th, which is the day that we launched our Balancing Act Community Priority Surveys, or Community Priority Survey. So that is open now to the public to provide their input on their top priorities for this upcoming budget year. Tonight is our special city council meeting, so you'll hear about the baseline budget and the draft capital improvement plan. We're scheduling a meeting in May, either a regular city council meeting or a special meeting for the preliminary proposed budget. From there, we'll make any changes as directed and present the revised proposed budget on June 6th, and then finally present the final proposed budget for adoption on June 20th. And if there are any additional changes that staff is directed to make, we do have June 27th listed just as a potential special meeting if necessary. And then lastly, the months of May and August, we will be working with a consultant to develop our long-term financial plan. So we'll be building that out a bit more. We have a number of master plans that are underway as well, so we'll be using those to inform our long-term financial plan. So that's why it's coming after the budget. Typically, it's done a little before the budget, but we have a number of components that we're going to be adding to that. In addition to that, we'll be working with the consultant to identify some additional revenue generating options for future years. Next slide. And next slide, please. So we work to develop the budget within the framework of a structurally balanced budget policy that is adopted by the city. This policy applies to the general fund, and that includes the main general fund as well as the Measure S funds. And the policy says that we strive to create a proposed general fund operating budget that is structurally balanced. And what that means is that ongoing expenditures are funded by ongoing revenue sources. This is to ensure fiscal sustainability as well as to stabilize expenditure levels over the long term. Next slide. So here's some examples of the recurring budget items that are included in the baseline budget that you have before you tonight. That includes our tax revenues, our fines, interest income, licenses, charges for services, and then recurring expenditures are those expenditures that support ongoing city services, such as salaries, benefits, utilities, maintenance, and other operational costs. Next slide. So some examples of the non-recurring budget items which have been excluded from the baseline budget. That includes things such as one-time sales of property as well as grant awards, things that we can't rely on as a revenue source over the long term. For non-recurring expenditures, that includes activities that are one-time in nature, and we have a number of those: council-directed initiatives, staff-recommended budget additions for some special projects and programs, and also capital improvement projects, which are considered one-time in nature, specifically because they, the acquisition cost, for instance, of a capital asset is a one-time cost. There could be costs associated with ongoing maintenance, but the initial acquisition is a one-time, even if the project spans multiple fiscal years. It's considered non-recurring. Next slide. So we'll now walk through the general fund baseline budget. Next slide. Some of the highlights from the budget is that, again, it includes the general fund and the Measure S funds. It does not include any other non-general funds. The baseline budget revenues or the assumptions for the revenues and expenditures are consistent with prior forecasts, and what that means is that we're not recommending or assuming any major changes to organizational structure or appropriations in the budget. So those assumptions are pretty much the same as what they've been in the prior year's forecast. At this point, the city's baseline budget is not balanced. As you can see in the report, there is a budget gap of about $464,000. And what that means is that our ongoing expenditures exceed ongoing revenues at this point. So with that being said, the city doesn't really have the capacity to add any new activities at this point because we do need to work to close that gap. And if we were to add any new activities, we would need to reduce amounts in other areas. Next slide. So on April 12th, it says April 18th, but that should say April 12th, we did present the baseline budget to the Finance Subcommittee. At that time, the budget gap was approximately $983,000. Since then, we've reduced it to $464,000, and the reduction in the budget gap is due to the following. On the revenue side, there was an increase of about $348,000, and that's from the Section 115 pension trust. And on the expenditure side, benefits decrease. This is to account for a non-recurring general liability premium for prior fire department staff, so we won't see this cost next year. And then on the operations and maintenance side, it decreased approximately $20,000, and that's just to account for several departmental expenditures that were identified as non-recurring, where we had them as recurring in the previous figure. Next slide. So here's a summary of the general fund baseline budget. This is the revenues. It's a comparison of the baseline for the fiscal year 2022-23 and 2023-24, and showing the dollar changes as well as the percent changes. As we can see, the revenue shows a 7% increase, which translates to $1.6 million. And I'll go into the details of these categories in the following slides. Next slide. I'm sorry, can you go back one? There you go, thank you. So this is a snapshot of the general fund baseline budget expenditures, and we're showing growth of 6% there, which is about $1.5 million. And down at the bottom line is the net results, shows the budget gap of $464,000. Next slide. Next slide, please. Oh, thank you. So here is a depiction of where the general fund dollars come from. So as we can see in the pie chart here, the majority of our general purpose revenues comes from tax sources. So approximately 82% of our total general fund revenues come from taxes, with the two main sources being property tax and sales tax. Next slide. So going through some of the specific categories, our property tax is the statutory rate of 1% that's assessed on real property. It also includes our residual and pass-through funds from the Redevelopment Property Tax Trust Fund. We're expecting a 19% increase, and this is mainly due to an increase in the residual funds from the resulting from the final payment on former redevelopment debt. Slide. On the sales and use tax, the city imposes a 9.7% tax on purchases made within city limits. The city receives a statewide 1% Bradley Burns sales tax, as well as 1% for local sales tax from the Measure S tax measures. And for this budget, we're assuming a 1% increase, and this is based on projections provided by our sales tax consultant, HDL. One thing to mention here is that the 1% is showing that sales tax revenue is starting to level off a bit following the height of the pandemic, when we saw some really sharp increases in revenues with online sales in certain consumer goods categories. They're starting to level off a bit back down to pre-pandemic levels. And so we are assuming a 1% growth over the current fiscal year. Next slide. Next is our utility users tax. This is levied on the consumption of telecommunication, gas, and electricity. We continue to see higher growth rates in the gas and electricity segments, between 7 and 9% over the last 5 years. So we are assuming an 8% increase for the fiscal year 2023-24 budget. Next slide. For our franchise tax, which is levied on public utilities and corporations that supply gas, electricity, cable, and refuel services, the city has long-standing franchise agreements with the corporations that provide these services, and we're assuming a 1% growth based on trend analysis. Next slide. For our intergovernmental tax, this is tied to property tax, and it is a tax on the ownership of registered motor vehicles. We also work with our property tax consultant, HDL, to develop the assumption here, a growth rate, and we're assuming 8% growth for this category. Next slide. So our transient occupancy tax, which is a 10% tax that's levied on short-term lodging, such as Airbnb and motel or hotel stays. We're assuming a 3% increase based on industry trend. So this is one of those areas that has not rebounded quite as quickly as experts initially predicted. So just a slight growth there, but we wanted to keep it pretty conservative for this one, just because the trends are showing something a little bit different than what we projected earlier this year. Next slide. A business license tax is assessed on all businesses doing business within city limits, and we're assuming a 5% increase based on trend. Next. Charges for services is comprised of public safety charges, and this is received from the Tri-Cities agreement that we have with the cities of Hercules and San Pablo. And we're assuming a 2% increase based on the formula in the current agreement that is in place. That agreement is scheduled to expire on June 30, and so the police department is in negotiations with those agencies to develop a new agreement. So this number, it may change by the time you all adopt the budget. Next slide. Other revenue includes all other revenue sources, including fees, permits, interest, reimbursements, and so on and so forth. The baseline budget assumes an 11% decrease, and this is mostly because revenues that were previously generated by the fire department have shifted from the city over to the Contra Costa County Fire Protection District under the Fire Services Agreement. Next slide. And then lastly, we have our transfer in, and this comes from the Section 115 pension trust, and this is to offset increases in pension costs. So the city has an established formula that we will memorialize in the form of a pension trust policy, which will come before you in May or June. But there is a formula that the city uses where we look at the estimated cost for the budget year, and we take the difference between that and the actual costs that the city paid in the fiscal year 2018-19. So we continue to use the same formula. Next slide. So looking at where the general fund dollars come from, this slide shows where the general fund dollars go. As we can see from the pie chart, the majority of general fund dollars goes toward personnel costs. That makes up about 60% of the total. That number is down from the 74% that it used to be, and that's due to the new fire services agreement that we have with ConFire. Next slide. So going through some of the expenditure categories, salaries and wages, currently the fiscal year 2023-24 budget assumes 116 full-time equivalents. That's down 16 from 132 FTEs in the prior fiscal year, and the reduction is due to the 16 staff from the fire department moving over to ConFire. It also assumes a 3% increase for a potential cost of living adjustment. Next slide. For benefits, it includes our retirement as well as fringe benefits. We're assuming a net 19% decrease. Again, this is due to a reduction of 16 staff, but also offset by increases in medical benefits as well as a significant increase in the workers' compensation premiums for all staff. Next slide. For operations and maintenance, it includes our non-personnel operations costs, so professional services, utilities, materials, and supplies. We're assuming a net 23% decrease due to major changes, one, again, being attributable to the fire department transitioning, and then also a 10% increase in the general liability insurance premiums across the board. Next slide. And this is just to show the fire services agreement costs based on the 5-year agreement. So the $5.7 million that you see here for the fiscal year 2023-24 is based on year 1 of the 5-year agreement that was approved. Next slide. Our capital outlay category includes all non-major asset acquisition and improvements. This includes smaller capital items or non-capitalized items such as computer equipment and furniture. All of the larger capital outlay, of course, is mapped out in the capital improvement plan. For this category, we're assuming a 19% increase. Not that we're adding many things, but just projecting the cost of some of those goods for, again, computer equipment and furniture to increase by 19%. Next slide. And the debt service is our ongoing principal and interest payments on the 2006 pension obligation bonds. This amount is based on the long-term debt obligation schedule. The last payment is scheduled to be made in 2036 on the pension obligation bonds. Next slide. And then the last category for expenditures is the transfers out, and those are basically subsidies that are provided to the recreation department as well as the PCTV to cover some of those operational costs that are not 100% cost recoverable. The majority of it does go to the recreation department, just because many of those programs are not 100% cost recoverable in order to continue to provide recreation services to the community without making them cost prohibitive. The general fund does provide a subsidy to the recreation department. Next slide. So here is a comparison of the baseline budget compared to the long-term financial forecast. We didn't have this in the last presentation, but just wanted to show that because I know some will go and compare the two. So just wanted to talk a little bit about the assumptions and how they changed since we came up with the long-term financial forecast for the fiscal year 2023-24. As we can see on the revenues, it's pretty close. If we're looking at total revenues, there's a small variance of about $5,963. That's before we add in the transfers in, which is the transfer from the pension trust. So that's the largest variance. And the assumption there at that time when we developed the long-term financial forecast, the 5-year forecast for the CalPERS pension costs were higher at that point in time. And since then, CalPERS, the system has realized returns on investments that were higher than were projected at the time when we put together the long-term forecast. So for the 2023-24 baseline budget, the transfer in from the trust is about $234,000 lower than we projected in the forecast. And then go back one, please. Thank you. And then for the uses or the expenditures, so this is the net of a number of things. One is with the transition of the fire department, so that was not factored in the original forecast because we didn't have any knowledge of that possibly taking place at that time. And then there were also some salaries and benefits costs that we did not account for in the long-term forecast. So there was one labor agreement that came after the forecast was put together, which included market rate adjustments for some positions. And those were not accounted for in the original forecast. They are included in the fiscal year 2023-24 baseline budget. So again, as we can see, the budget gap at this point is $464,000. Next slide. So looking at the results, this is a summary of the fund balances, so projected through the end of the fiscal year 2023-24. So starting at the top, the preliminary beginning fund balance at July 1st of this year, which would be for the 23-24 budget year, is approximately $10.5 million. If we were to factor in revenues the revenue amounts and the expenditure amounts as they are reflected now with the budget gap, we're looking at a preliminary ending balance of approximately $10 million. When we factor in one-time initiatives, and we'll look at those in just a moment, and capital projects, which are all non-recurring, we are looking at using about $4.7 million of fund balance for those, or unassigned fund balance. And again, just a reminder that unassigned fund balance is the residual unrestricted fund balance. And then under that, we have the transfer to the general reserve, which is about $764,000. So that's actually higher than we projected in the forecast. And the reason for that is mainly is because we've experienced some interest rate losses over the last 2 years. So we have to make that up with a higher transfer from the general fund to the general reserve to meet our cash reserve policy target. So with all of that taken into account, we're looking at the general fund ending balance for 6/30/24 of about $4.7 million. And then for the general reserve ending fund balance, which is again separate from the general fund, we're projecting a balance of $9.7 million. And for the pension fund, after the transfer in to account for or to cover the increase in the pension costs, we're estimating a balance of $14.8 million at the end of 2024. Next slide. So going into the next phase of the presentation, everything that has been presented before this is all baseline items. Again, those were all of our recurring revenues, all of our recurring expenditures. We wanted to include these one-time items for your consideration. Again, not accounted for in the baseline budget, and if they were to be funded, we would be using unassigned fund balance to fund these. These are items that the City Council directed staff to include in the budget in the last 2 fiscal years. They have not been completed, but we did want to highlight them so that you have a chance to consider rolling them forward to the fiscal year 2023-24 budget, again, to be covered by unassigned fund balance. So these are those one-time items that the staff would ask for your consideration and direction on whether to move forward with those, to take a look at the amounts and see if there are any modifications, any additions or deletions that you would like us to incorporate into the preliminary proposed budget. So that's why those are listed here, again, separate from the baseline budget. Next slide. So the next steps will be for staff to evaluate any council member additions, if you have any, or modifications, and incorporate those into the next version of the budget, which will include baseline plus all of our one-time items and capital improvement items, and present that budget to the City Council at a meeting in May. And we're still working on finalizing a date, whether it'll be a regular City Council meeting or a special council meeting in the next few weeks. And that concludes my presentation. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Great. Thank you so much for your presentation. We'll go to council questions first, and we'll start with Mayor Pro Tem Toms.
Sure, thank you. On slide 37,
If we can have the presentation go back to slide 37.
yeah, thank you. So where it talks about the fund balance of 10.4 million on the top.
Yes.
Is that the same fund? Is that also considered reserves?
It's considered unassigned fund balance, so the general reserve is considered reserves.
So
Does that answer your?
I'm just wondering if, I'll ask it again, maybe a different way. So is our reserves within the unassigned?
Yes.
It is within
Yes.
that, okay. And then the general reserves, the second to the last line, where it says general reserve ending balance 6/30/24, is that the 9.7 million, is that within our policy goal?
Yes.
Okay, great. And then there was another slide where we're going to be working on a contract with San Pablo for dispatch.
Dispatch.
And is that going to change with any labor agreement? Is that going to be 100% covered? So the question was for San Pablo, the agreement that we have for dispatch is whatever labor agreement we come out with, is that going to be completely reimbursable? Whatever, like if there's a certain percentage of increase that goes for that union, then we will then, that contract will reflect it.
Yeah, so the staff report and the slide presentation pointed out that we're in the midst of negotiating an updated agreement with between Hercules, San Pablo, and Pinole for the operation of our West Bay Communications Center, which is the police dispatching that Pinole does on behalf of those three communities. That agreement has a cost-sharing formula, and so all of the costs that the City of Pinole bears to perform those services are shared by all of the agencies. And if the City of Pinole experiences increased costs to perform those services, those are shared by the other agencies. Pinole, of course, continues to bear its pro rata share of those expenses for the dispatching that is done here, but something like 2/3 of the total costs of the dispatch operation are borne by our two partner cities.
Okay, great. Thank you. That's all I had.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem Toms. We'll go to Councilmember Sasai for questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Director Guillory, for the presentation. On Table 1, on page 5 of the report, when we look at by department for City Council, City Manager, and City Clerk, there are a -7%, -11%, and -4% change to each portion of these budgets. Can you please explain a little bit why that occurred, and is that something that we experience each year?
And you're referring to the table in the staff report, right?
Yes.
Not the presentation. Okay, just want to make sure. So there are a number of things. There are some items that were considered baseline items before that we went back to fine tune and determined that they were actually not baseline, they were one time. And so since we're only looking at the baseline and we pulled out all of the one times, or one-time items, it appears that the budget decreased. It didn't really decrease. We just shifted the classification or the type of item from baseline to one time.
Got it. Thank you. That's all the questions I have right now.
Okay.
Thank you, Councilmember Sasai. We'll go to Councilmember Tave.
Just a couple questions about the sales tax. In 18-19, we were at about 8.5 million in sales tax, and we're currently showing 9.6 million. What can we, I guess, and I know this is a hard question, but attributing that to, I mean, like, how does a 1.6 or 1 million jump like that? I mean, where does that come from? I know that there's been legislation regarding sales tax that's out there and online sales and all that, and we talked about that a while ago during COVID. I'm just wondering, is that extra million something we can rely on moving forward, or is it something that's like a one-time deal, or do you have any information around that?
The 1 million that you're referring to, is that the difference?
Delta.
The delta between 18-19 and which year was that? 18.
So the 18-19 report, similar to this one, and the current report is showing about slide 17 is showing about 9.6, and I'm trying to figure out, you know, how do we get that extra million, and frankly, how do we do it again, right? Like, I mean, where does that come from?
So it's probably a bit hard to answer right now. I could do some research
I know, like,
on that
I
to
mean,
see what
is there more business licenses? Is there? I know we had vacancies that we were looking at in the buildings. We had some vacancies filled. I don't know if there's anything that sticks out for staff.
Is it sales tax or
the
total? Because you mentioned sales tax, and then
yeah, I'm looking at slide 17.
Okay.
Sales tax. Then I'm looking at sales tax, 8.483 million. for 2019 and 8.3 million for 2018. And I'm seeing 9.6 million on slide 17. I'm trying to figure out over that course of time, we obviously made more money in sales tax. I'm trying to figure out, like, trending wise, are we trending up, and what do we attribute that to? What type of activities?
Contributing factors. Yeah.
So we've talked about it and consulted with the city's sales tax consultant, HDL, on this. It seems like a big number, $1 million. One thing to keep in mind, it's on a high base, so it's not actually that great a percentage increase over that number of years. I mean, we're really only talking about, 9 million to 10 million, which is about a 10% increase over a few years. The main,
Right.
the main factor, I think, is that there was a big run-up in consumption, particularly in online sales during COVID, as people were outfitting their home offices and kind of lifestyles. And so there was a big run-up that was more significant than, people were unsure at the outset of COVID which way things were going to move. Were people going to become more fiscally conservative? I don't think anybody really anticipated that they were going to be spending more on things, but it now, in retrospect, makes sense because of the remote working and the need to outfit home offices. And so I think a lot of it was attributable to that. And now, as Director Guillory mentioned, that run-up has happened, and now it's flattened out. So whereas we were seeing, 4 and 5% increases year over year previously, in this upcoming year, we're expecting a 1% year-over-year increase. So it's come up and it's flattened. I will say, and as Director Guillory mentioned in the presentation, the revenue forecast, and so for a number of the revenues, we use HDL to provide the forecasting. They've been very, very reliable and precise. And then for some of them, we do our own in-house forecasting, primarily based on trend analysis, which have also been very precise. And so, as you saw, the difference between the forecast, the baseline forecast we did in the last long-term financial plan back in June 2022, and this baseline forecast is really a difference of a couple $100,000. So we feel pretty confident about the forecasts for next fiscal year.
Okay.
We will be doing a 10-year baseline general fund forecast and presenting that at the same time we present the preliminary proposed budget, so at a meeting sometime in May. And that will build in more long-term projections about those revenue trends, and we'll be relying on HDL. So I don't expect us to lose any money on sales tax. The question is, are we going to continue? Is the new normal going to be 1% year over year? Or is it going to be returning to what had been normal previously, which is something like 3 or 4% per year?
Got it. The reason I'm kind of asking that question is that we did a report back in 2018 when I first got on council. I think Councilmember Martinez Rubin was on that council when we made the vote to go with HDL to do kind of a market analysis of the area, considering the vacant buildings and the other things that were going on. And I'm just wondering, typically, it sounds like you guys got it internally, and we don't really need to go to HDL for that again. But establishing those benchmarks of, okay, this is where we are, and I don't know if that would be a practice, or if we do it in-house. It sounds like you guys got it dialed in-house, so it doesn't really need.
Well, I think it's a combination of factors. Some is just the city's good fortune, I think, based on some past investments by the city council. So as you know, we continue to have vacant spaces re-tenanted by desirable retailers. So that's happened. No single retailer usually makes all that big of a difference in sales tax, but continuing to have new retailers like Nordstrom Rack, Home Goods come is certainly a boon. There is a action step in the economic development strategy to continue to identify opportunities to attract retailers where we have gaps. So we haven't implemented that, but that's the long-term trajectory. So yes, we will be looking at opportunities to attract those retailers.
Great. Okay. The only other question I had was, and I think you've already answered it, was the money we're getting from the county. It looked like that was reflected in the intergovernmental for the fire service, or is that a pass-through, or is it something that?
No, it's not a pass-through.
Got it. So it goes directly to.
Yes.
Okay, cool.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Mr. Mayor, that's all the questions I had. Thanks.
Thank you, Councilman. Oh,
If I may
yes, City
clarify
Manager.
that, it's actually netted out of the expenditure we show for the fire services contract. So the amount that we show in the budget for the fire services contract of $5.5 or so million dollars already includes the $2 million or so Measure X funding netted out of that. Otherwise, our invoice would be for, we'd show an expenditure of 7.5, and we'd show a separate revenue of $2 million of Measure X. Those are just combined, and so we get just an invoice or an expenditure item that's the net.
Got it. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, Councilmember Tave. Councilmember Martinez-Rubin.
Thank you for the report. Okay, I'll take them in order as I've got tagged the numbers of the slides. On slide 24, related to business
Excuse me,
license
through the
tax.
mayor. I'm not
Yes.
hearing the audio. Would you check your microphone?
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
Checking on the audio? Okay.
you.
I'm going to go by in numerical order of the slides. On slide number 24, on business license tax, there's a projected 5% increase. Is that increase in the actual license fee or in the number of businesses, new businesses anticipated that would be taken
It's-
out, or a combo?
It's the license fee.
License
So,
fee?
yeah, we don't assume any new businesses. We just use the baseline.
Okay.
Look at the fees, yes.
Okay, I'll start saving my pennies. With regard to the CC, Contra Costa Fire, the fire services agreement, the amount there, the 5.6, which has been under discussion for years now, and now we're implementing augmented services. There were several slides that talked about 16 full-time equivalents now going over to Contra Costa County, so there would be a decrease in cost. What is overall, just a big overview of what that 5.6 is paying for, if it's not in full-time equivalents?
The 5.6 includes the staffing. So it does include the staffing that are going to be assigned to the Station 74. It includes pretty much the same categories that we have in our budget. It includes operations and maintenance. It includes utilities. It includes dispatch services. Andrew, am I forgetting any?
And I think another way to think about it is there are some things are moving in buckets now that we have this contractual arrangement. And so let me flip to the slide that I think, give me one moment, please. So slide 16, I think, provides the best illustration of what's happening here. So whereas in fiscal year 2022-23, we were essentially paying for the fire services in Pinole, we're paying that to our Pinole Fire Department and our City of Pinole firefighters. And so the costs for those, our fire protection services, are being reflected in that salaries and wages line, right? Those are the salaries and wages for our firefighters, in the benefits line, the benefits for our firefighters, and some in some other places. So there are certain operations and maintenance things our Pinole Fire Department was doing that are now going to be covered by the Pinole by Con Fire. And what we're showing on this slide is that in 2023-24, that the cost for our fire services in Pinole is now being accounted for in that separate line item, which is and so because we're now paying for our fire services through that line item, through this contract for service with Con Fire, and that amount, that bill we receive and pay, which is net the Measure X contribution, includes all the salaries for those Con Fire firefighters, all the benefits, all the equipment. And so that's why the main changes in the baseline from last fiscal year, for the current fiscal year and the upcoming one is, hey, it looks like our salaries and wages are going down. They're really going down because we have 17 fewer city employees. Those are just, that salaries and wages line is the salaries and wages of city employees. We have 17 fewer because we no longer have those Pinole Fire Department employees. Instead, we're paying for that fire service through this other line item. And similarly, the benefits costs have gone down in the same way.
Okay, so it's a separation out, creation of a separate line item.
That's right.
But the difference between, there is no difference in costs last year and this year. As we see, there's no percentage change.
Well, it's the difference, any difference in cost is illustrated in the independent fiscal analysis that we went through, and that determined that kind of in the long run, they're equivalent cost as long as we're getting the Measure X subsidy. But there isn't a side-by-side comparison of what had previously been Pinole Fire Department versus Con Fire because we're relying on that independent fiscal analysis. I also think that we're going through a transition period right now and kind of working out all of the details of the operation, which, by the way, has been going very smoothly. And so there might be some additional adjustments to those cost figures that we can circle back. We owe an update, a midterm update to the City Council on how that contract for service is going in the future, so we can include the cost figures then as well.
Thank you. Thank you. You've helped me understand better. When I first heard there were 16, I thought it was 16. You mentioned 17 fewer FTEs. I didn't see that. I expected that the equivalent amount of that reflected in the overall budget as a decrease, but it's not. It's reflected in a separate line item. Thank you. Okay. When we want the other, huh? But in any case. One more question. On slide 37, that's the summary of fund balances. The line that reads one-time initiatives and capital improvement projects totals to about $4.6 million. When I add the one-time items for consideration on the following slide, number 38, that's about 1.185 or 1.2. So the difference between approximately 4.6 and 1.8, whatever that math is, what are those one-time initiatives and capital improvement projects? Where do we see that? Will we see them later in tonight's presentation?
Yes, you will. In the capital improvement presentation, it'll show the various projects and how they're funded by the general fund, which includes some funding from the Measure S. The items that are listed in the one-time initiatives, this is on the operating side of things, and so I wanted to highlight those for your consideration, but you will see the capital projects that are funded by the general fund during the next presentation.
Thank you. To make sure that I understood what you just said, Director Guillory, the one-time items for consideration you consider as being accounted as an operations expense, as a set of operation?
Yes, operating initiatives, council directed.
Operating initiatives, as opposed to capital improvement projects.
Correct.
And if I may add a little bit there, there's a lot tied into those ideas, and so sometimes we use fund balance, which is a one-time resource. It's a pool of resources that is not being replenished, right? It's money. It's like money you have in a savings account. It's appropriate to use those for one-time expenses. And so as is listed on slide 38, there are a number of projects that the City Council directed staff to complete and appropriated one-time resources for. And I'll talk more about that in a second. So if you total those items there, as you noted, Councilmember Martinez-Rubin, that explains a portion of the general fund balance that's being used on one time. The other portion of that are capital projects that are being funded by general fund, including the two Measure S's. So you'll get to see all of those as we talk about the CIP project. And the differentiation between what we call a capital project and what we call an operating project, I mean, the capital projects are usually capital in nature, meaning they relate to infrastructure. But there's also a gray area regarding the magnitude of the project. And so, for instance, some of these projects, like the municipal broadband feasibility study, you could consider that a capital project because it's a feasibility study regarding potential capital improvements, installing broadband fiber and other things. Or you could consider it an operating. There's a little bit of an art and science. But if you look at this list of projects and you look at what's in the CIP as being funded by the general funded Measure S's, it will total that $4+ million. One other thing I'll mention, said I'd return to this. These one-time items for consideration will be included in the preliminary proposed budget. So we're not asking you to, and most of these are underway. So, the active transportation plan is already in the CIP and will be in the baseline CIP. Same with the Brant Street improvement, Brant Court improvements. Same with emergency power. These other things, we already have the RFP out for municipal broadband, recycled water. So actually, most of these are already going to be in the preliminary proposed budget. They're one time, though, instead of ongoing, so they're not in the baseline. That's the distinction. Let us know if you have any other questions on that.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that, just to clarify, because I know I did say operating. I think there is some overlap between the operating and the CIP as far as how these are classified. One thing to point out is they're all funded by the general fund, including the Measure S's. So that was another reason they were highlighted for you as well.
Thank you. And so council approved that kind of funding.
Yes.
If there should be some alternate source of funding midway, then does staff make that move that source of funding, or does it come before council for us to get the good news that we have this alternate source of funding now available to us, and so it helps kind of free up those funds for something else? How would that happen?
Yeah, so it hasn't happened, but should it happen? Because it is a difference between.
I'm optimistic.
Yeah, we should be. So it will come before council because that is one amending the budget. If it's a different funding source, anytime there's a change in funding that is different from what you all adopt, we would bring it before council.
And it does, I'm thinking back on my time with Pinole and elsewhere, it does occasionally happen. So, for instance, we've had to take care of a number of one-time community development-related projects. Related to updating the housing element, some of our other elements, creating objective design standards. And there have been state funds, grant funds, that have become available that we could use for those projects that we might otherwise have determined we'd need to fund with the general fund. And for the capital improvement plan, if something is being funded by a local source and a new funding opportunity comes along, yes, we'll then, of course, preserve our local funds because we have the most flexibility there. And sometimes that would require coming back to the city council, but not always. It kind of depends on the nature of the grant funds. But we're certainly always on the lookout for bringing in outside funding sources so that we don't need to use our local funds.
Thank you. And help out with my poor recollection here, if we have had a discussion on council about the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, and if City of Pinole is eligible for any of that funding. Generally speaking, that would be available for roads, bridges, and rails, access to high-speed internet connectivity. So I was wondering if any of the projects that are now listed on that one-time items for consideration list could indeed be funded by that if we have received any funding at all.
We have not received any funding.
But there is a future agenda item scheduled in May, I think, to discuss the funding opportunities, which is a council requested item.
Okay, identifying some specific projects that may be funded or that we would present a proposal for funding. Right, okay.
Great, thank you. After 4 years, this is kind of starting to make sense a bit. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Martinez-Rubin. We'll go to the public comment section of this item. Madam City Clerk, do we have any public comments?
Yes, thank you. First speaker is Rafael Menes.
Good afternoon, Mayor, Council, staff, members of the public. Audio working properly? Okay, good afternoon, Mayor, Council staff, members of the public. I have a few comments I'd like to make on this item. First off, we had, I was a little bit confused by one of the points in Director Gilroy's presentation saying that there was less expenditure expended with regards to CalPERS, because when CalPERS made a presentation to the council, I want to say a month or two ago, they were talking about how they'd had massive losses, and so as a result there will be near-term increased demands. So I'm a little bit confused by that. Secondly, I noticed that a lot of the change in expenditures was due to an increase in workers' compensation and, more generally speaking, liability premiums. I think it was like a 10% increase for liability and a 19% increase for workers' compensation. And I was curious as to a few different points on that. First off, why those numbers increased so significantly, given that the overall pool of the city would seem to be lower risk with the removal of fire from the covered pool for both those categories. Secondly, whether that level of increase is typical year over year or whether this is an unusually high level of increase. It seems to me like it might be unusually high, but I'm not certain about that. With regards to the general reserve and need to offset interest losses, does the general reserve fall under the overall investment policy? Are the funds, I think I might have gone over this before, but I don't recall. So are the funds of a general reserve invested in the same manner as the pension investment funds, or are they just in LAIF, or are they in a money market account, so on? And then finally, going on to back to the staff report, Table 1, page 5, there were a few things I noticed there. There was I think a 28% increase in expenditures for the finance department, a 70% increase in expenditures for the human resources department, and a 9% increase in expenditures for the police department. I'm assuming that the increases for police and human resources were due to new staffing, the hiring of a human resources director for human resources in particular. But if that's not accurate, I'd be curious about that, because for most of the departments you see, the 3% year over year contracted increase, but it seems like markedly higher increases in those categories. In finance, the 28% increase in particular seemed notable. So I was curious as to the reasons behind those changes. And finally, I wanted to thank Director Gallery for including slide number 36 in response to my comments at the Finance Subcommittee meeting. It's helpful to be able to directly compare the baseline
That's
budget.
time.
Mr. Menace.
Okay, the timer wasn't running, so.
We were running that one. Sorry about that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for letting me know.
We'll go to the next public comment, and then if
Thank you. Irma Ruport.
Thank you, Mayor, Council, staff, and public. I'll make it really quick. Thank you for the report. Excellent. However, just a couple of comments. On the community development and recreation, I like it separate the PCTV. I think it should be a separate item. That's what I want to talk about for future item to be discussed. On my part, I think it's very important. I'd like to, if it's possible. And the other thing that was just mentioned about from one source of funding to another, if it could be changed through staff, I believe that's what I heard. Any changes on this reports financially should not happen by staff at all, no means whatsoever, unless it is a grant funding and the purpose has to be spent and it's already been told to the council. But I don't see no expenditures from the city should be made except by the consent of the council. And then also on grant funding, if it comes back in May, there's grant funding currently right now, have deadlines in May. Please don't miss those deadlines. If there's any grants that you're looking at right now, I am looking at some and they have made deadlines. I am making sure that if we can apply, it's that I'm drawing a blank, but I think I mentioned at the last council meeting. East County is the one that Keller Canyon grant. I think Maureen knows about it. I'm sorry, Mayor Pro Tem. I'm sorry, I'm going blank. But there is a deadline, I believe, the first week of May. So let's assure ourselves that we can make it with those deadlines. Okay? Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have any other public comments?
Yes, Cordell Hindler.
Yes, can you hear me, Heather?
I can hear you. Go ahead.
Yes, so good evening, Mayor Murphy, Council. I am Cordell Hendler, and I'm a Richmond resident. So thank you, Finance Director Gillard, for that presentation. So one of the things that I've noticed in the slides was for the one-time items for consideration, the bit $10,000 for a business development. I'm thinking, I'm confused. So my only comment is like, can you elaborate on what that amount is for, so that way I can get an understanding? That's it.
Okay, it looks like that concludes the public comments.
All right, thank you so much. We'll go back to council, but before we go to council, I'll go to Director Guillory. I think you had a few clarifying comments on the budget. You don't have a time limit, don't worry.
Yes, I can respond to Mr. Menace's questions and comments. So for the CalPERS rates, you mentioned that during the last presentation that the representative presented information on the CalPERS rates and the losses that it recently experienced. So yes, we will have to deal with those next year. So in the previous year, the CalPERS valuation and the 5-year forecast on what the city's contribution would be were lower because at that time the system had experienced some returns or higher than expected returns on investments. However, that has reversed. And so in the next budget year, which would be the fiscal year 2024-25, we will see the impacts of that. So hopefully that answers his question. On the question regarding their insurance premiums and why the significant increase, and especially when the fire department has transitioned to ComFire, well, the city is still responsible for the payment for this upcoming budget year, and we've also captured that as a one-time item, and going forward, we will not be responsible for the premium for the fire staff that has transitioned. So that is a one-time impact for the next budget year. As far as the general reserve, and does it fall under the general investment policy in terms of the types of investments that we invest the funds in? Yes, it falls under the city's general investment policy, which is different from the Section 115 pension trust policy. We mainly invest in certificates of deposit, U.S. Treasury bonds, and some of it is in LAIF for that. And then as far as the significant increases in the departmental baseline budget, starting with the finance department, it's not necessarily that the expenditures increased, but we had a staff member that helps out in the finance department, so our admin staff person, that was actually allocated to other departments in the past. More of her time has been allocated to the finance department because she is taking on a number of finance tasks that are vacant position, which is an accounting technician, has not been filled, and she's picked up those tasks. So basically a good portion of her salary or her costs have been shifted over to the finance department. For the Human Resources Department, there were, so we had already captured the salary for the Human Resources Director, so that's not one of the contributing factors. There were other factors that were included, some non-personnel costs for a number of ongoing items to support the city's human resources operations have been added to that budget, and those will be ongoing. Did you want to add anything to that, or? Okay, just yeah, okay. And those items are related just to legal services in the Human Resources Department. And I think that was it.
Okay, thank you. And we'll go to council for other questions. I do have a quick question. The sales and use tax on page 19 of slide 19 and page 9 of 16 of the staff report. slide 19 and page 9 of 16 of the agenda packet. It says that the overall sales tax rate on purchases made in Pinole is 9.75. Do we have data that compares this to other cities in Contra Costa County or other surrounding counties?
We actually do. I don't have it before me, but we do have that information. It was included in the revenue workshop that we had sometime last year where we compared it to other cities, but I can send that to you.
Okay, can we just get that by the time this comes back to the council at the next meeting?
Sure.
It'd be nice to know it'd just be nice to know where we compare to those and a good reminder for the council. And a quick question on... A quick question on slide 7, which is the budget development key dates. So there are a number of important dates coming up that, again, thank you for creating this slide and letting the public kind of know how to continue. This is our special meeting and really the first step of many meetings as we develop our fiscal year 2023-2024 budget. We launched the Balancing Act Community Priority Survey on April 20th. Can you let us know how might the public utilize the survey to, again, help us make decision-making around the budget and what ways the survey was set up to help us make the next steps in decision-making?
Sure. So we set up the Balancing Act survey using the prioritization module. So it's more of a qualitative survey. It has a number of priorities and initiatives such as things around or projects around transportation, around streets and roads, municipal broadband. There are a number of options. I think there's about 12 different options. And what we're asking the respondents to do is to pick their top 5 priorities and then to rank those. And that we will report those results back to the City Council for you all to consider as you make decisions around how to fund those various initiatives. We'll also be working with the Public Works Department to set up a similar survey just for capital improvement projects. And that will be used in the same way. We'll report on the results of that and what those top priorities are from the community.
Thank you. And then in the 10-year, you mentioned a few variables that I would assume are going to impact the 10-year forecast, including the CalPERS announcement. Are those a part of that conversation? So when that conversation comes, I believe that is, for some reason, I think that's a June meeting, but it doesn't list it here, the 10-year forecast. But we're supposed to talk about that in May or June. Are those variables going to be discussed in that 10-year forecast conversation?
So yes, and also just keep in mind too that the 10-year forecast is the baseline forecast as well. So, but yes, we'll consider those factors and bring that information back for that meeting. So that'll be it'll be presented with the preliminary proposed budget at that same meeting. We'll present the 10-year forecast.
Okay. Great. Council, any other questions or comments? Or, again, this is providing direction to staff for the next step of our budgetary process, so also motions around staff direction or questions that you may have are germane to this conversation. Councilmember Tave?
I just had a question. Councilmember Martinez-Rubin, which bill were you talking about? You mentioned something earlier about grants and what was the name? Was the name of it? Because it might be the same one I'm thinking of. I think it probably is. Because mine was the Inflation Reduction Act, 2022. And that, I guess we'll get to that in the capital improvement plan. But trying to understand what funding is out there, and I think it's in line with a lot of the projects that we were talking about having shovel ready, solar projects, the building efficiencies, and trying to see if those line up. But I guess that's probably next presentation, right? Or is it okay to try to get some kind of understanding of what impact that might have on us? Do you need direction from council to start exploring that? Which projects are shovel ready? Which ones can apply? That kind of deal.
Yeah, so the future agenda item relates to the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, and I'm trying to remember whether we recently received funding through the Inflation Reduction Act. Was the funding that we got for the gap? Yes.
thought you were gonna hit you with it. You were like,
Yeah, the HCIP Cycle 11 funds were, I believe, from the BIL. I forgot the acronym for that, but that was funded through, I think, bipartisan infrastructure.
So we don't have a future agenda item related to the Inflation Reduction Act, so we can add that to either our discussion of the preliminary proposed budget or the preliminary proposed CIP. So can we make sure to address that as what funding opportunities there are going to be? Some might be capital, some might be non-capital.
well, so the building efficiency was one that caught my eye. The solar, I think they had a lot of home programs that the recover the methane gas from the wastewater plant, the things that we've talked about for years here that I think we just never really had the funding to make it happen. And that was part of the push to have shovel-ready projects so that when this funding does come, we would be ready for it. And I think we're a couple steps ahead of a lot of people, or a lot of other municipalities, just because we've been thinking about this. I'm just trying to understand, because a lot of this money has shot clocks to it, like 2026, 2031, which means like we're quickly approaching those lines, and as we know, a lot of times this money gets eaten up really quickly by larger companies, and trying to figure out how do we, kind of slide into maybe getting some of it. And I think there's reimbursable too. So like any projects that we've currently done, you can go back to and say, hey, yeah, and I think it's like a 40% match, and then they reimburse 60. I'm just shooting from the hip here. I haven't got that, but that's what I've heard. So it's a possibility. I don't know if staff can just look into that and see how that would weave into this program. We might be able to reduce a lot of our costs by supplementing with a grant program. I just, I know we have a small team, and trying to get all these projects lined up is going to be very difficult, but just keeping it realistic in what we can and can't do.
So I think that would be a natural thing to incorporate. We've, over time, been adding more information on the grant funding sources to the CIP. Now there's an intro, and I think at the Finance Subcommittee meeting, there was a request for some additional information to be added regarding the grants policy. So why don't we add information into the preliminary proposed CIP on CIP project funding from the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure bill / infrastructure act law. Yes.
And just for the council, this happened in August 2022. So this is like, in the world of grants, is pretty like recent. But there are shot clocks to this. So what we don't want to do is miss those windows.
Mm-hmm.
So it was in the works from, what's the date here? 2021. So it's almost like a year for it to actually get passed. And then now it's like we're letting that small window where we can try to reach for some of that money.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Councilmember Tate, that's an important question. I know the last council meeting we approved a resolution that directed staff in our city to become a partner with the Contra Costa County's Inflation Reduction Act conference. It would be helpful to get some guidance a little bit more. My understanding is IRA funds, which is the Inflation Reduction Act funding, is only accessible directly to agencies with that represent 30,000 people or more. That does not mean we can't apply for funding through other agencies we're a part of. For example, MCE or WICTAC are opportunities for us, or the county would be an opportunity for us to partner and gain access in partnership with an agency. But again, it would be great to have that from staff confirmed, because I don't want that to be up in the air. I think it's more important for us to actually have those answers. And my understanding is that has been a challenge for the Inflation Reduction Act, whereas for the infrastructure, bipartisan infrastructure law, those funds are able to be directly to all agencies, regardless of the amount of people we represent. But on May 18th, our staff, one or two, and City Manager Murray let me know who those folks are, but one or two of our staff will be attending the Contra Costa County Inflation Reduction Act Conference, which will be a space for the public, specifically elected officials and city and county officials, to be a part of a conversation to determine how partnerships can be made to make that happen.
So just a question on that. So if we have 19,000, right, we don't hit that 30,000 threshold, right? But if we were to combine, I don't know, San Pablo, us, and Hercules, we would hit that threshold and then can partner with some type of regional activity, right? And then the infrastructure project, just so I'm clear, that one doesn't matter population. You can go after whatever grant funds you need.
Yeah, that is my understanding. But again, I would love for staff to circle back to us with a full report about that.
Okay.
I think the U.S. Treasury is setting out those guidelines and guidance. So
perfect. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, of course. Any other questions or comments, Mayor Pro Tem Toms?
Just make a comment that some of the one-time initiatives would fall in line for some of the environmental parts of grant funding. And if recycled water feasibility, that could be a planning grant perhaps, and that could be something that we would look at, first of all, if there's planning money out there, and if we partnered with Hercules, we would likely hit that target. Things like the broadband feasibility study, that again we can look at planning grants for that. Unfortunately, we don't qualify for the Keller mitigation funds. That's only in East County in the Pittsburgh Bay Point area, and then it expands a little bit into Antioch, but we don't fit that the criteria for that. But that is good looking at it. And that's all I had.
Thank you. Councilmember Sasai?
Thank you. The direction, I guess, that staff is looking for are preliminary requests for potential fiscal year 23-24 general fund budget additions or deletions. Does that only pertain to the items that are listed in Table 2 of the report, which are just the general fund one-time budget items?
Yes, at this point, yes. Or if you have any suggestions for changes to the baseline budget, then staff will consider those as well, or evaluate those requests as well.
Understood. And additions, possible additions or suggestions to projects to be added to the CIP would not be included in this item.
It would be in the
yes.
next item.
Yeah. So, and to clarify, this is where we've last year we instituted a slightly different budget process, which we're following again this year, which is asking the City Council to surface ideas they have for budget changes early in the budget process, which is now. So the City Council can take action to remove any of these one-time projects that have been approved in the past, although many of them are already scheduled or some are partially underway. But you can also make any other recommendations or it's really requests for information at this point on any other changes to the general fund budget. And the idea of surfacing them earlier is so that city staff can go back and create pretty precise cost estimates and also look at the kind of the operational feasibility of them. So we welcome all of those tonight. And in the next item, Director Mishra and Ms. Carr will be asking for input on capital projects in the same regard.
Understood. Thank you for explaining.
Councilmember Martinez-Rubin, any questions or comments?
Comment with the request for staff to do a little bit of research and come back to us to let us know about the possibility of amending the agreements with our franchisees to the extent possible. Let me find the page. With that average percentage of tax, I'm wondering about the range, and if it's regulated, if that tax amount is regulated, then we won't be able to do much. But if there's some wiggle room with that, for us to know about it and consider. And along with that, the timelines for when the new contracts are due. Thank you.
Right. Any other information to be received for the baseline budget? Yes, Councilmember Tate.
So as this budget's developed, and I'm noticing we're about $500,000 in between last year and what we're projecting for next year. I guess, and I know this is not something that's easily answered, but how much of that is needs and wants, right? I know that the challenge for staff is to move the organization forward and grow and provide the wants to grow the department. But I mean, if we were to say there's a percentage of room in the budget, or is this packed to, exactly what we can afford? I mean, and don't get me wrong, I value the fact that we're investing into the departments, we're investing into the city. I'm just trying to figure out, if stuff goes wrong, what kind of room do we have to adjust, move? Are we nimble enough, or are we kind of pushing everything up against that one number? My concern is that we're asking a lot in the CIP. We're asking a lot of staff, and I just want to make sure that what we say we're going to do, we actually do, and that we don't try to max everyone out to the point where we're hitting diminishing returns.
Yeah, so it's actually a topic we'll be discussing at the strategic planning special meeting on Saturday in quite a bit of detail. There are many levels of activities that staff is working on, different types of activities, and we'll go through those in detail. The city council's own financial policy, the balanced budget policy, requires that city staff propose an initial budget that is balanced. So when we return to the city council at the May meeting yet to be determined, it's either going to be at the special city council meeting on May 16th, although we're also looking into the possibility of having a special meeting in that same time frame. That preliminary proposed budget will be balanced, meaning there will be measures that are incorporated into that to close that $450 odd thousand gap. And that's in ongoing baseline items. So it's not going to be, it can't be deferring one-time expenses or deferring ongoing expenses. So yes, Director Guillory and the department heads have already been putting our heads together to figure out how we're going to close that gap. As Director Guillory mentioned, also just some more precise estimates and more fine-tooth combing of the baseline budget has resulted in a big reduction in our estimated shortfall just between when we presented this to the Finance Subcommittee and now, where we've been going through with each department in detail and looking at every single expenditure and saying, is this really an ongoing expense, particularly regarding things like professional services, or are we going to use a consultant to do this one time and then we're not going to need them to do it every single year, particularly in light of the fact that we've added staff capacity in some areas. So I think the solution to closing that gap is going to come from two directions. One is continued fine-tuning of the baseline, and discussions with all the departments about what things we can now in-house now that we have more capacity, and also some other fixes. So yes, that gap will be brought to zero, and then it will be the city council's decision whether it wants to adopt a budget that uses some one-time funding for ongoing purposes or not. But that's something that the council will get to decide.
I guess the other question I had, and I mean, I know this is multivariable, and that first pass happens, and then the second pass, and the third pass. To the grants portion, this committee meeting that we have with the county may be fruitful, and the CIP now requires staff to shift to another project that may have grant money associated with it, so there's savings to those one-time funds. How does that, I guess, get evaluated, or will that come back to council to have that discussion to say, sorry, Brant Court, we don't have enough capacity, and I guess maybe we'll talk about that on Saturday, is we don't have enough capacity to work on that project for you, but we do open up capacity in this other area, then can get a consultant to work for, you know what I mean? Like, that balance that's there, I'm just trying to understand if we shift all our resources to things that benefit the organization, and financially benefit the organization, does that come back to council and we have that discussion again? Okay.
Yeah, and I think the timing is such that we don't have to figure those things out simultaneously. I mean, anything we learn about grant opportunities is still a few months at least down the road. And so I think the way that the process is going to play out is the city council will adopt the operating and capital budget, and it will adopt a CIP, and then subsequent to that, based on new news about funding from any kind of source, if the city staff identifies that if we shift direction to a different project, we can get some outside funding, we would bring that back as we have even this fiscal year in a mid-year adjustment to the CIP.
Right.
So we can get through the budget adoption and the CIP adoption process, and then if there are new funding opportunities or any other changes in circumstances, we would come back to the city council to have a discussion about whether to reprioritize.
I just think it's to Council Martinez-Rubin's point, like, if there's an introduction or an infusion of money that has strings attached to it, that changes, pretty much changes the perspective of the council if we can increase that operating budget. So, thank you. I'm looking forward to the CIP conversations. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Absolutely. Any other information or comments or questions? All right. Thank you all so much, and thank you again for the presentation about our budget. And we look forward to our May meeting where we're talking about more. If we can just have a recap on next steps as it relates to this conversation, that would be helpful before we move on to the next item.
So the next steps would have been for staff to evaluate any changes that you may have presented. So none were presented. So the next step for us would be to, one, as City Manager Murray mentioned, is to work to implement some budget balancing measures to bring that gap to zero. And then we'll put together the preliminary proposed budget and bring that back to you for your review and consideration at the meeting in May.
Okay. Mention that we will incorporate information into the two elements of federal funding into the next round of discussion, particularly the CIP, and we'll look into the issue of the franchise agreements, which is particularly relevant. We'll have a near future council agenda item to receive direction from the city council on how to go about procuring our successor refuse management services. That contract's current franchise agreement is coming to an end in June 2025, and so we need to decide what we're going to do regarding establishing a successor agreement. So that's the one that I think is most significant monetarily, but also has a time limit that we provides an opportunity for us to change the revenues.
Okay. And I think we had a couple of information questions. Are those going to be provided at the next meeting as well? Okay.
So there's questions on the sales tax was one of them. So yes, we'll bring back information on that.
And then IRA and the bipartisan infrastructure law memo is coming up on a council meeting, but
yes.
Is that also going to now include an IRA guidance as well?
Yes.
All right. Anything that's missing, council, that we didn't? Yep. Councilmember Martinez-Rubin.
Thank you. Quick question about the open period for public input on the Balancing Act. Through when? Will they have an opportunity?
So it'll be open for 3 weeks, and it opened on April 20th.
And accessing it is a matter of going to the city website?
Yes, city website or the city's Facebook also has the link.
Thank you.
Great. All right. Not seeing any. Again, thank you for the presentation and looking forward to our May meeting to talk about this more. We will continue on with our agenda for
item 5B, which is the overview of the draft fiscal year 2023-2024 through 2027-2028 capital improvement plan. This evening we have both our director, our public works director, Mr. Mishra, as well as Ms. Carr, our capital improvements and environmental program manager. I'm surprised they fit the entire title on your name tag. Again, thank you all for presenting. Please.
Good evening, Mayor, Mayor Pro Tem, council members, city staff, and members of the public. Tonight, I will be going through a draft overview of our capital improvement plan for fiscal year 2023-24 through 27-28. Next slide, please. So our CIP is a 5-year plan that we use to identify and implement our capital needs. The draft that is in your packet contains 32 capital projects and 7 infrastructure assessments. For the upcoming fiscal year, there are 30 capital projects slated for work, and then 7 infrastructure assessments. These projects are categorized in various categories, beginning with facilities, parks, our sewer projects, stormwater, streets and roads, and infrastructure assessments. Next slide, please. Here's a summary of the projects in the draft that you see. The first 4 projects are either complete or anticipated to be complete by the end of this fiscal year. There are 3 new projects that are listed here, 2 of which are grant funded, and then 1 that was added at a mid-year adjustment, which is the safety improvements at Tennant Avenue at the Pear and Plum intersections. There are 2 projects here that don't appear in the draft, and then the last project is combined. It's the residential slurry seal project, which is a combination of various other projects. They've all been combined into a single project. Next slide, please. So here we have a budget summary of our 5-year CIP and the various sources listed on the left in the table. Our total sources required for the upcoming fiscal year are about $14,292,853, and our 5-year total is $54,230,599. I'd like to add, since our meeting with the Finance Subcommittee, we were able to meet with Finance and staff to evaluate some of our projects and how we could move funding and possibly use our growth impact fees. So a lot of the burden that was previously on Measure S has shifted, and we are going to be relying on our growth impact fees to fund some of our projects. Next slide, please. So looking at the 2023-24 year that we're focusing on, here we have categorized our categories that I mentioned earlier and the totals in each of those categories, as well as the sources of funding. And here you can see that we are going to be relying on growth impact fees more than we have in the past. Next slide, please. So the next steps before we come back with a preliminary proposed CIP, one thing that we'll be adding is a tree mitigation project to annually address our tree removal. But we've also had some immediate trees that need attention because of the storms. So we'll be coming back as we evaluate and formulate a cost estimate for that project. But we will seek reimbursement from FEMA to address that project. In addition, what's not seen here, but you will see it in the next version, is a facilities master plan, which will be added. We estimate that cost to be about $200,000. And then in our unfunded and unprogrammed list, that's part of the CIP, you will also see new projects that will get added on, and those are going to be taken from our recently completed master plans, one being our local road safety plan, our sanitary sewer collection system master plan. So we'll be programming those projects, and then if there is grant funding, then we'll look to that grant funding to fund some of those projects. So tonight we're here to hear from council and receive direction on projects that you wish to add or possibly delete. And then we will use that entire list, and we will use the prioritization matrix to rank our projects and develop a work plan for next year. And then, as Director Guillory mentioned, we'll also be using the Balancing Act to get input on the CIP. and then we will return in next month to have a preliminary proposed CIP for your consideration once we incorporate those changes and receive direction from you tonight. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, we're here to receive direction from council. There's some work that we'll be doing on our end to continue to refine the CIP. We will bring back a preliminary proposed CIP for council's consideration, and then we will be presenting that proposed CIP to our planning commission so they can review the projects for general plan consistency, and then we hope to bring back a revised proposed CIP and a final CIP for council's consideration in June. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you. We'll go to council for questions. We'll start with Mayor Pro Tem Toms.
I don't have any at this point.
All right, Councilmember Sasai.
Thank you. On the CIP, I see so it's RO 2303, which is Pinole Smart Signals, and the project origin was staff recommendation. When was this sort of incorporated into the CIP? And when it says project start July 1st, that's just more of the planning part of it?
So the Smart Signal project is actually a project in collaboration with CCTA. When the city submitted a grant application for OBAG 3 funds for our Pinole Valley Road tenant improvements, CCTA proposed a countywide project with all the jurisdictions in the county to upgrade some of the signals on our arterial roadways. So mostly that project is sponsored by CCTA with a small match from the city. So that project was programmed when we submitted our OBAG 3 application, and we indicated our interest to participate in terms of updating our signals, which was also a recommendation of our local road safety plan.
Great, and this is similar to kind of like synchronizing our traffic?
Yes.
Okay, and on a description and the history, status, impact of delayed sections, a lot of description is about the safety and efficiency of multimodal mobility, but also decrease in travel time, total delay, number of stops. A lot of discussion when it comes to pedestrian safety and bicyclist safety is the speed at which cars travel through our roadways. And I'm wondering if this project could be a little bit counterproductive to the need to reduce speeds of drivers on our roadways. And one concern that was brought up to me by the public was how this may impact potential green wave, where traffic signals are synchronized in a way where stops are not permitted.
So the Smart Signals project mostly going to look at the regionally significant route and the arterials, and those are which is San Pablo Avenue and Appian Way and Pinole Valley Road for the city of Pinole. So the nowadays the smart signals are actually adaptive. Adaptive meaning it depends on how much traffic you have, and accordingly whether the signals will be synchronized to let the traffic through or have the designated time intervals for stop and go when there's not much of traffic. And the new signal systems are intelligent. That's why the adaptive systems are what they're trying to propose for the major routes. And the intent of having slow speed is actually relevant in downtown areas. I believe San Pablo is a stretch of where we can expect such, and that will be achieved because we have so many traffic signals, very short distance there. And those timings and all, if we so desire, that we can program into, and probably once the project is developed, we can discuss those with the consultants.
Got it. So the timing's determined through sensors.
Yes.
And it adapts based on average speed of traffic, or is it just?
It could be multi-factor, meaning it could depend on the speed or the volume, and it can get details from other signals or other cameras installed previous traffic signal lights and all that. So it is basically programming how good it is programmed, or the intent of the users or the cities how to use that particular roadway.
Mm. So it could be programmed to be adaptive to where if, say, traffic in a specific corridor is very low, that there could be more stops.
Yes,
to
it can be.
Drivers from going straight through a roadway at, 20 plus 10.
Yeah, usually that is how they're done. Great. But during commute hours, I know a lot of people probably say this, during commute hours, they are synchronized to move traffic. They're not synchronized to provide stop on a major route. So,
thank you. That's all my questions for right now.
All right, thank you so much. Councilmember Tave.
So on slide 5, I saw that we used the 276 growth impact funds for sewer, and such a high dollar from the sewer enterprise fund. And I know the sewer enterprise fund is usually pretty well funded. Was there a reason why we took $600,000 there from the growth impact versus completely using the sewer fund?
So one of the reasons, as I mentioned, in our unprogrammed and unfunded list, in the next version that you'll see a lot of projects that will come from the sanitary sewer master plan. And that master plan has identified projects over a 20-year period, 10-year period, and a 5-year period that will far probably exceed the amount of funds that we have in the sewer enterprise fund. So we wanted to be able to leverage the fees that are in the growth impact fund dedicated just to sewer to be able to use those in the project.
Is there a reason that you went from 425, 265, and then to 6? Was that just the type of project that we're expecting over? Oh, I'm sorry, wrong page. Hold on, I'll flip over. Here we go. Growth impact. So it looked like 825,000, and then 100,000 was the overtime.
Yes. So
slide 5. Slide 4.
Slide number 4. Yes. So in terms of what is listed in the future, we haven't. So what we tried to do was we looked at the growth impact fees that we have, but we anticipate that from the newer projects that are coming in, we'll collect additional fees, and then we will schedule those projects accordingly in the future years.
Okay. Okay. And then in the past, we talked, and I know with the sewer master plan, we talked about sewer laterals and them contributing to the I&I that we're receiving down at the plant. How do we, I mean, I know we have mechanisms in place now with East Bay Mud, like if you buy a home, you have to have it checked and stuff, but what can the city do, or what kind of program is there to help residents start to proactively look at their sewer laterals? And I mean, is it more of a grant program or a stipend program? Have you guys seen any other programs that are out there that can help facilitate that? Because it's my understanding our I&I is really high, and in reducing that I&I is going to benefit the plant, benefit the city long term.
So currently, city doesn't have any program to help the homeowners financially. But as our sewer lateral ordinance was adopted, I believe it was 13 years ago, 2012, it required actually all the homeowners to complete their sewer lateral video and correction of any defects they may have. So, and also there is a clause there, if a home is going to get sold, before it closes, then they have to complete the repair work. But we have been working with most of the homeowners, and we gave them enough time, even if the closer, they can close the house, but we give them about 90 days time. Once they prove that they actually have already hired a contractor, they're willing to complete that work, and so we gave them 90 days extension.
Thank you for that. Do we have an idea of how many homes were inspected and how that might drive the sewer master plan? The I&I. Like, have we seen a reduction in I&I, or is it going up?
No, I mean, a reduction would not be visible as of yet, because one of our major projects that where we are actually experiencing these overflows right now is in design. Once that is over, I would say you would see some reduction because of and the size, upsizing the current pipe and removing, those I&I only for those major locations. So as far as now, I can't say that there is a reduction because we haven't done any projects. We are doing the private sewer laterals that we are pursuing, but that also we are not saying that we are aggressively or actively pursuing. It is as it comes, people know, we try to educate them, but we are not going after people who haven't completed yet. But we are just gathering that list right now where it is complete. Then we'll send a educational material telling them hey, you have to complete this sewer lateral work soon.
The reason is that none of those bills have anything in there regarding sewer, and that's still one of those outstanding items that I think the city's going to have to deal with at some point. But it sounds like we have that project going on, and it sounds like that's probably the major point of inflow. So the residents, like that residential sewer lateral, is not necessarily the biggest issue that we have, or account for the most.
No, can't say that.
Okay.
So the reason I say that is recently we actually did some calculation even for our own facility, the wastewater treatment plant facility. It doesn't have any stormwater separate facility, so it goes to the sewer in the plant. We did a calculation during a normal day. About 1 inch of rain, it is about 350,000 gallons from that facility itself.
From our own facility.
From our own facility. So you can imagine if it's a bigger, there is a big subdivision or something where it actually is, some of the stormwater is going to the sewer.
Got it.
Could be significant.
Okay. And that's this project that we're looking at. This larger project, the $2.8 million.
That's going to solve one portion of it, where we're having the Baker tanks and Pinole Avenue and all that.
Got it.
That's what we're trying to address.
Okay.
To add to that, we're also working to video inspection our entire collection system, which will help us identify some other sources of I&I.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah.
Those are my questions.
Great, thank you. And Councilmember Martinez-Rubin.
Time for feedback, input?
Questions. Yeah. And the mic. Use the mic if you can.
Okay, one moment. I'll save my comments for time when we're providing input. Thank you.
Of course, absolutely. We'll go to public comments soon. I just have two questions. The first is about slide 5. The slide 5 lists out the fiscal year 2023-2024 totals by fund. Sometimes even I, as a council member, get confused because our general fund is incorporating some of our fund balances. When I read slide 5, it says that $430,000 is being used out of the general fund for this upcoming year. Okay. The last presentation we had showed a balance of about 400,000. Is that correct? In terms of how the baseline budget was imbalanced?
Yes,
Am I reading that correctly? Okay.
that's correct.
So have those, because those fund balances are around specifically the general funds being used for streets and roads as well as infrastructure assessments. Have you all considered what other pots of funds outside of the general fund balance can be used? Because what I'm reading when I see that is that 430 is a different funding mechanism than the 106, which is the Measure S tax, 200 gas tax, 214. Have those purchases, even though they've been approved by council, have you all considered what other sources by fund could be used for those accounts?
So, yes, we have. And just to clarify, so the numbers that you saw in the previous presentation, that incorporates all general funds. So a general fund plus the Measure S funds. So I just wanted to make that.
So that baseline budget includes the gas tax, the solid.
No, not gas tax, just the general fund, so Fund 100.
Okay.
And then it includes the Measure S.
106.
106 and 105. You don't see it here because.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it includes those three.
But it does not include 200 gas tax,
No.
214 solid waste,
None of those.
276 growth impact fees, 325.
Nope.
Okay.
And then what I will say, Mayor, is that we went through, so initially we had more of the capital projects that were allocated to the Measure S 2014 fund, and we were able to leverage the funds and the growth impact fees. So a good portion of that has been moved away from Fund 106 to the growth impact fees.
I see. Okay.
See that reflected there.
So that assessment was done, and you all feel that 430,000. There's no other fund that could be used for that 430,000.
That's correct.
For the fiscal year 2023. That's the assessment you all are
Yes.
making. Okay, just wanted to be clear about that because I saw those numbers. I'm like, whoa, those are very close. Okay. And can you tell me about why that's your assessment? Is that because they can't be used, or is it because of a balance of how much funds you want to pull out of the other funds? Or I guess that assessment's important in understanding. So.
Yeah, it's a bit of a balancing act. And then also when the city council directed staff to add it to the budget, that was the funding source that was identified by council. And even if we moved it to the Measure S funds, it's still general fund. We can't move it to any of those others because they have restrictions attached to them. Okay. So the only options we really do have are out of the three general funds.
Okay, gotcha. Okay. And then this infrastructure assessment. So this is a new this is, I think, the second, maybe the third time we're now using infrastructure assessment as a category in our capital improvement plan. The question I have is, when we develop those infrastructure assessments, we oftentimes are paying, anywhere between $100,000 and $300,000 to do an assessment. We've done, and you all listed out a few that we've done, like the local road safety plan, which was an incredible endeavor by our city to understand how we can improve our roads a little bit more and really center around pedestrian safety. How are you all making the transfer of those plans into actual projects? Most of the plans have projects or have at least listed out objectives. So what does that process look like for you all, and how are you incorporating staff recommendation into the next steps of those plans or assessments?
So, as I mentioned, in the next version, when the proposed preliminary comes back to you, you'll see a lot of the projects that came out of those two master planning efforts. But just to give you an example, the local road safety plan identified some safety improvements, and that was one of the top projects identified in the local safety plan. So staff was able to take that recommendation and apply for 8SIP funding and get funding for those particular intersections, and that was now programmed as a project. So our goal is to, once a plan is complete, once we have projects that begin to be, wouldn't say shovel ready, but give us the basis to apply for grants or leverage the work that we've done in those master planning efforts, then staff is able to go out and seek grant funds and then program those projects. So any of the projects that do end up getting funded, you'll see in the capital improvement plan. But the ones that are identified needs through those projects will appear in our unfunded and unprogrammed list.
Thank you. And then just a last question for the tree mitigation. I know this has come up a lot in this last year with the rainstorms. I actually got an email during this council meeting about another tree, so it is an issue that's important. I do want to take it back to 2019 where the Cities Beautification Ad Hoc Committee recommended a tree master plan. I'm wondering if there's been consideration of how those two different items, I know the tree master plan is an unfunded project on our capital improvement, and then what I'm seeing here is a recommendation from staff to add a tree mitigation plan as a funded, I'm sure you probably aren't just asking for it to be unfunded, so as a funded mitigation project. Is there, I'm wondering if you all have considered room for those two to be intact with each other or in conversation to one another, given that they kind of are talking about our trees. As we cut down trees, I'm also thinking, are we building back new trees in our city and creating space for that?
So I'll begin to answer this. The tree mitigation is really an immediate project to address what we've experienced as a result of the storms. Mm-hmm. And the tree master plan is a bigger effort that looks at opportunities for tree planting or managing or determining if we have enough trees or if we need to plant additional trees. So the tree mitigation plan that we're asking is more of an immediate funding request that we want to get reimbursed through FEMA. But the tree master plan is still an unfunded project.
If I may add to that, I think one of the purposes of this meeting tonight is to receive council direction on adding projects to be incorporated into the preliminary proposed CIP, and I'm sure we would all be happy to receive council's direction to incorporate a funded tree master plan into what will come back to you as the preliminary proposed. And that would cover things like these trees that need to be mitigated on city property. It would also include things like what kinds of street trees we should plant, how we might involve the community, like the garden club, in replanting, and it's much broader scope, but would certainly address the trees in the unmaintained open space that we're mitigating due to the immediate nature of them.
Okay, thank you. And actually, just one question, because it made me think about our funding mechanisms. I know this year we've endeavored to actually go through the California State Legislature's district process on request. Do we have a status of those requests? And even if they're not, we know about the information, is there a timeline we'd get information back perhaps by the next council meeting about this?
We haven't heard back on the status of those funding requests, but we will provide an update as part of the next budget meeting. I'm trying to think of whether those are all capital projects, and they are. So as part of the discussion of the preliminary proposed CIP, we'll provide an update.
Okay. The reason I asked is I was wondering how that, I'm assuming that we probably would get those requests upon an approved budget in June by the California State Legislature, but I'm wondering how those requests would be would impact the different budget summaries around sources by fund in the I don't know what you call these categories, perhaps like my understanding is one of those requests is around facilities for the senior center, and the other request is is it water related, or can you give the background for the request?
Yeah, the two requests that we submitted to our two Congress people and our state assembly member and state senator were for rehabilitation of Fernandez Park and for funding for various components of the senior center and parking lot upgrade. So those are the two projects that we submitted for funding. I don't think that there's a requirement that funding decision timeline be incorporated or synced with our budget adoption process. Okay. If we receive funding for those projects, the senior center auxiliary parking lot and greening project is already in the CIP and as a funded project. If we receive funding either from the state or federal sources, it would just supplant the local funding that we would otherwise use.
Okay.
The Fernandez Park was not a planned capital project. If we receive funding for that, we would add it to the CIP.
Okay.
And only the City Council makes changes to the CIP, so in terms of the formal process, we return to the City Council with a recommendation to modify the CIP.
Thank you. All right, so we'll go to Madam City Clerk to see if we have any public comments on this item.
Thank you. Yes, Rafael Menez.
Good evening again. Rafael Menez, resident of Pinole, and I've got a few questions and comments. First off, with regard to one of Mayor Murphy's questions about the difference between I think it was the net surplus deficit and the amount listed on slide 4 of presentation B. I think the part of the difference is just that presentation B is showing one-time costs. So the differential in the first presentation is for the baseline budget is showing ongoing costs. So that $430,000 would be part of the, let's see, it was $4,661,350 that you could see on slide 37 of the first presentation, rather than offsetting the ongoing cost of, $464,058, which is all ongoing expenses, not one-time expenses. More broadly, I was curious, and I brought this up at a few prior meetings, whether it would be either beneficial or possible to combine unfunded projects UF 016 and UF 017, the sidewalk improvements and the retaining wall for the shale below the church between Oak Ridge and Tenant, to create sort of a San Pablo complete streets project, whether the council classifying that as sort of a unified project would make getting grants easier, or whether that wouldn't make any difference at all. I figured this would be the appropriate point and place to bring that up as a question. With regards to the growth impact fees, would it be possible in future versions to also show the remaining fund balance for the growth impact fund? Because growth impact fees are a limited source fund. They're one time, not an ongoing. So it might be worthwhile having that for comparison. I assume that the plan is basically to have it go down to zero by FY 25-26 based on the rapidly decreasing rate of usage from 23-24 to 24-25 to 25-26. And then finally, for the unfunded total, I'm assuming that most of the unfunded total for FY 24-25 is related to the San Pablo Avenue Bridge project and the delays in state funding for design, review, engineering, so on and so forth. But are there other major projects that are contributing to that substantial unfunded total? Thank you.
Thank you. Do you have any other public comments?
Yes, thank you, Mayor. We do have an online member of the public with the phone number ending in 5748. Go ahead, sir.
Hello, can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Yes, my name is Anthony, longtime resident of Pinole, homeowner, taxpayer of over 40 years. I just wondered whether or not we have something in place that we don't have to necessarily have to wait for these major CIP projects to take effect, whether they're 2 or 3 or 5 years out, and that I think we really need to be more proactive, if not preventative, with certain projects or implementing certain measures to provide better health and safety standards in our city to our public. Case in point, the painting and striping of speed bumps up and down Sarah Drive near Shea and all throughout the city, painting and striping of the speed limits that are supposed to be on the roads that are all faded out, painting and striping of demarcation lanes on the roads and streets, painting and striping of the sidewalks that are all faded and obliterated. Those things should be taken care of, I think, right away, as well as cleaning up the traffic signage around the cities that are right now being obstructed by overgrown bushes, trees, and branches, not to mention the stoplights that are still out of order that up and down Pinole Road, there are about 3 or 4 stoplights from Henry going up Pinole Valley Road, as well as on the turnabout on Adobe Road. That doesn't lend well to the job that we're getting or expecting from our Public Works Department. And I thought City Manager Murray said he had people finally go out after a 1.5-year hiatus of COVID, go out a few weeks ago up and down the city and Pinole Valley Road. But we still have light outages throughout the city. And we've also reported them to several people with the city. So I don't know how many workers or people it takes to screw in a light bulb to do that. But I think we should be more proactive, like I said, as well as do preventative measures rather than relying on the CIP dates and so on, and be more, rather than just be reactive to things after the fact along those lines, as well as things we can do to improve the overall health, safety, and quality of life standards within our city and our public.
Thank you, Mr. Tony. Thank you. Do we have any other public comments?
Yes, Irma Rupert.
Good evening again. Sorry, Heather, I forgot to put B on there. Apologize. Mayor, really quickly, I'll make it really quick. Again, I want to pitch the improvement on cable TV. Please put it on the CIP. It's not on there. We don't know what the allocation is for cable TV. It's an important asset. It's something we need to utilize to its fullest, and we're not. And I just want to make sure that I'm going to be pitching this until we get it done right, because we do need a lot of help in cable TV. Dave's now doing a great job. It's not on him, it's on us. And let's improve that area that we need, that we have a resource and we're not completely utilizing it to the max. And the other thing about surveys, Mayor, they don't work. What happens is a lot of people can't connect to the website. My opinion is put a table up there. I'll sit there if you want me to. I'm currently on the Community Services Committee. I can sit there at the table, run these surveys for the city if you're interested on Saturdays, and put a desk down at the senior center to get these surveys going, because they're not going anywhere. We don't get enough people entertained on the website. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have any other public comments?
That concludes the public comments.
All right, we'll close public comment for this item and go back to the council for any other questions, comments, or motions. We'll start with Councilmember Martinez-Rubin.
Thank you. Comments. So this is input. Although I realize that what I suggest will not necessarily be funded, I'd like the projects to be considered to augment the list of unfunded and programmed in the future kinds of projects. Okay, and some of these may dovetail to what was presented to us last year as part of the CIP. So either they're related detail or standalone projects. I'll leave it up to you, staff, to determine how these would fit. additional to the public comment about the painting and striping and demarcation of traffic lanes and curbs, pedestrian walkways, those kinds of items, I don't know whether they are regularly programmed as maintenance projects or whether we ought to add them as something on a project list for the CIP, but that is one area. Assessment for repair and maintenance of the pedestrian walkways alongside Pinole Creek. Last year, there was an item, UF 009, to repave trails, and I'm unsure, just based on that, whether that was referring to the creekside trails. I suppose that, yes, rather than the bay trails, which would not be within our jurisdiction necessarily. Handicap access at Pinole Creek Trail near Sarah Court. Don't know whether that can be done at the same time or as a supplement to what we, as council, recently approved for paving. But it's that spot at the bottom of Sarah Court to allow for greater use by both wheelchair-bound persons as well as those using other vehicles, modes of transportation that could fit on that part of the creek trail. Related to this, and this will take a bit of research, I think, by staff, as to whether the bridges belong to us as a city or some other entity. But the pedestrian bridge near Jamba Juice near the shopping center right now is a wooden bridge. There are patches to it, which probably will last for a little bit, but to have a more enduring kind of surface would be a consideration, and also an assessment of the condition of pedestrian bridges at Plum Street as well as over at the Pinole Valley Park. I think I mentioned repainting of pedestrian crosswalks. For example, west of the Appian 80 Shopping Center on Terra Hills Drive is another example additional to what the public comment was that we heard. Elsewhere, that may require an assessment throughout town. And again, you can let me know if staff is already doing some of that work on a regular basis, periodically throughout the year. I've mentioned this in prior meetings, and you can let me know where this fits. There's one problem signal, and it's a problem signal because it's on Appian Way and Canyon Drive that often gets moved. The direction gets moved by big rig trucks. Don't know whether that's within our jurisdiction to take care of or whether that's a Caltrans item, but it is a safety situation there, wherein the signal is moved. It doesn't face the traffic that ought to be paying attention to it, and it gets confusing there. Earlier, there was mention of the signalization and sensors on traffic lights. I wonder if when that project comes to fruition, there is also consideration for sensors for the lighter vehicles, like the scooters and the motorcycles. I have heard from motorcycle users that they have to place a certain kind of magnet or mirror on their vehicle so that the sensors that are at the signals or near the signals can actually detect them. I imagine that nowadays there's better technology to help with that, and in our interest to support and promote alternative vehicles, that could be something that we could probably improve on if at all possible. Thank you. That's it.
Thank you. We'll go to Councilmember Tave.
I think we brought up the dog park and the fencing and the separation between, I know that's a small one, but I'm not sure if that's been handled, but small dogs, the big dogs are playing with the small dogs, and the big dogs hurt the small dogs. It's happened a few times. It's all over next door. Wondering if that project can get put on the CIP. I would imagine it's probably something not too difficult to do. I wanted to ask about the Parks Master Plan and really kind of get an idea of scale and magnitude. I know we haven't received the Parks Master Plan. It's not for public consumption yet, but just in general, I'm imagining that's probably going to come in over the next few months, right? It's pretty far out. Okay.
We were expecting it'll be complete by the end of the calendar year. But we just had a kickoff meeting with the consultants.
Were trees incorporated into the Parks Master Plan?
No.
Okay. Is it, and I know we talked about doing a trees master plan is it easier to do an add-on to that Parks Master Plan or scoping to capture at least the trees that are within the park and then the open space? Or would that hit the capacity of that contract?
We can't change the scope of the Parks Master Plan without increasing the amount of the contract, which would require coming back to the City Council. The Tree Master Plan would address street trees and other things that would. So I still think that would be valuable. I think depending on what the question is regarding the trees in unmaintained open space, that may or may not be within the scope of the Park Master Plan. So, for instance, the Park Master Plan might recommend that the city transition those unmaintained open spaces into maintained active recreation spaces, and if so, there would need to be some improvements, trails, maybe benches, and you'd need to get rid of the trees. So I think it really depends on what the question you're hoping to have answered regarding the trees in those areas is about the best mechanism to get to that.
Right, just trying to get to the answer quicker, and if we are, and not double up efforts, right? So if it's not included in the Parks Master Plan, then it probably makes sense to have a separate contract. I'm just wondering if it would have been easier to kind of get that into that contract instead, or were they evaluating that in the first place? So,
but we are having there is a separate potential CIP, which is the tree mitigation specifically for those city-owned unmaintained open spaces.
Got it. Okay. Around November 2021, I went to, I think it was a Cal Cities conference, and I know that there's companies out there like, there's the solar one that we were exploring, and they come in and help out with the infrastructure. And then there was one that I had contacted city staff regarding sewer and methane capturing and the improvements surrounding that. And I know that there is some of that woven into these grant opportunities that are out there. And I don't know if that's something that would be beneficial. It might be a net zero, and we're just doing great for the environment and removing carbon, but the chance to generate energy. And I talked with Tamara like a while back about that to see if there was opportunities for it. But now that there's possible funding to explore that, I'm wondering if companies are out there that are really looking at helping cities get there. I know that we're partnered with Hercules, and that's probably another, sub-conversation that needs to happen first before it actually comes to council. But I'm just wondering if we could start exploring those type of, possible projects that are larger in scale, but we get help to actually get them across the finish line.
So the city actually has, the wastewater treatment plant has a small cogeneration facility that is city staff, as a staff-initiated project, recently restarted. So we are using some of the exhaust gas it's actually used for a boiler for heated water for the digester process. But we are issuing an RFP for all city facilities for energy conservation, generation, and storage assessments. So the use of waste gases at the wastewater treatment plant for energy generation would be within the scope of that. Okay,
so is that not in time for this go around for capital?
I think they will have completed the assessment by the end of this calendar year. So it can't be, we won't know what those projects are. They'll be incorporated into the CIP in the same way that Ms. Carr mentioned for the other master plans and assessments.
Got it.
I will add, I think I recall that conversation back in November 2021. I believe the company you're referring to might be Energia. And in talking with wastewater treatment plant staff and exploring other options, the problem or the issue is that our treatment plant does not accept food waste, which is kind of necessary for many of these technologies to work. And then a lot of plant space is required to implement something new. So those are kind of some of the challenges that we came across as we were exploring those solutions. But that's not to say that we aren't talking to other companies that might have solutions for the sludge that we do have.
Great, thank you.
Thank you so much. We'll go to Councilmember Sasai.
Thank you. So is this time open to proposals?
Actually, yeah, we have public comments, so this is now proposals and comments.
Thank you. So the, excuse me, the project I'd like to propose, and it's going to be a complete streets project for San Pablo Avenue. I've had a conversation with John Nemeth from WICTAC, and I believe the process to find funding for the preliminary design would be very similar to the Appian Way Complete Streets project, where our city could apply for STMP funds through the West Contra Costa Transportation Authority. It's a project that I think would serve our community well in terms of street safety, but also I think will be even more important in the coming years when we have housing developments happening in other parts of San Pablo Avenue, but mostly for right now in Old Town Pinole, where I've received so many different concerns from constituents who live there and have seen traffic accidents time and time again happening in Old Town Pinole. So that's my proposal. I would like to ask if there's a certain way that we could incorporate that into the preliminary proposed CIP. Would it be done through a motion, or do we have to explore that in a different way? And that's a question to either City Manager Murray or Director Mishra or City Clerk Bell.
How fitting was that?
Mm-hmm.
So, I'm trying to recall whether we've had votes on council requests for additional information. I don't recall that we have, and so similar to some of the requests that were made regarding providing additional information on potential changes to the budget, we're happy to. So the process is that we will come back at the next meeting at which the CIP is being discussed with additional information on what the scope of that project might be, what the budget might be, and what funding resources might be, and then the City Council at that time would make the decision of whether or not to include that into the CIP when the City Council approves it. So we're happy to come back with information on that potential project, and then the City Council can decide whether to incorporate it into the CIP. If there's no currently available funding, it can go onto the unfunded project list, although it sounds like we would start with a planning grant first. And so it's possible that we could use city resources for that, like Measure S general fund resources. And as we've mentioned, sometimes we earmark some general fund resources while we are also pursuing other grant sources. So that would be a fine. Yes, we'd be happy to come back with more information on that.
Great, thank you. So it wouldn't require a motion to have that considered in a future discussion?
I think we've required formal votes and motions in the past for this. It's really a surfacing of ideas, and we'll come back with that information. It's not, there's no budget allocation or anything yet.
Yeah, and so what I hear you asking is it required? It's not required, but you are more than welcome to make a motion as a council member.
Sounds great. Well, I'm looking forward to hearing more about the scope of that project in a future discussion during the budget process. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Mayor Pro Tem Toms.
Yes, thank you. I have several kind of follow-up questions to some public comments that I heard. There were several comments regarding things that I think really belong on the budget and not on the CIP, and I just wanted to confirm that. And if that's the case, then if we can kind of, bookmark those for further discussion the next time we talk about the budget. And that is, things like the maintenance, preventative striping, things like that. I believe that those really don't belong in the CIP, but if we could, I would just make a comment that, if we could have Public Works beef up the budget or give us some alternate language for that, and also for the cable TV. I know that we've moved on from talking about the budget, but, since we're talking about both of these things, if we can get some idea of what costs for upgrading those items that members of the public brought up. And then as far as we requested an earmark for Fernandez Park improvements, would it be beneficial to add that project as an unfunded project in the CIP so that we can, have a fallback that, to justify our request is that, we do have it in the CIP. That one, and, I would be in favor of San Pablo Avenue Complete Streets Planning Grant. And that's where we kind of identify what the scope of the improvements would be. And there's, that staff knows the different funding sources for planning grants that would be useful. And I think that kind of wraps up my comments. Again, thank you.
Great, thank you, Mayor Pro Tem Toms. I did also want to ask about the PCTV master plan. I thought that would be coming to this this current version of the CIP. Is there a decision point that is still yet to be made there, or?
No, we just haven't issued the RFP for to hire a consulting firm to conduct that.
Okay.
So a discussion of the budget of PCTV as well as the budget for some of our routine maintenance on operations, including things like street striping, curb painting, would be appropriate items to discuss when the preliminary proposed budget comes forward. Coincidentally, we owe the City Council some information on our routine schedule for road striping, center line painting, and curb painting, so we'll bring that forward at the same time, as well as some additional information on what additional level of effort, what our regular schedule is, and what additional level of effort would cost. And yeah, similar regarding PCTV.
Got it. So will PCTV master plan be an infrastructure assessment? Is that the category it would lie under?
No, it's really about the operations. It's not an infrastructure project, and I think it's already been funded. So I think it's in this current fiscal year budget. It's just that we haven't gotten to getting that project completed yet.
Okay, so the media studio, I see, so I hear operations, but I'm also considering some of the infrastructure that PCTV has, including its ability or inability, for example, to, if we were to have a meeting in the senior center or other areas of Pinole, it's my understanding that there's been challenges in terms of getting the right infrastructure to do those things. So when I hear operations, I'm also seeing some challenges we've had in terms of getting PCTV where it needs to be. I think the business plan we talked about a couple months ago, while it was, I think, a 2006, or I actually don't remember the date, it's pretty outdated, it talked about some of the undergrounding that PCTV did in probably the 60s or 70s along Fitzgerald Drive. So are those things going to be considered in the assessment of the master plan, or?
I don't think they would get into that level of detail. The master plan would get into that level of detail. I think the master plan is really about what's the role of a community access television station in this era, particularly when there's so many different channels to share video content and different ways to create them.
Okay.
So I think that's really the emphasis, is kind of higher level where PCTV should be heading over the next 5 or 10 years.
Okay.
There's has been a long need for an assessment of the equipment. But I think that in theory, the idea is we figure out big picture where PCTV is heading, and then once that goal is identified, we figure out what steps are needed to get us there. When people have talked, when I've had conversations with people in the past about PCTV equipment and capabilities, it hasn't included a discussion of its ability to service some different meeting locations. So that may or may not, again, that would need to be a follow-up step, and we could advance that if we knew for sure that we wanted to have that functionality. I guess it would be a question of what the cost would be. The lines to Fitzgerald, I think, are that you're referring to are actually police department related. There used to be a video surveillance program that was up on the Fitzgerald corridor, but there was PCTV lines that ran out to Pinole Valley High School, which facilitated the broadcast of football games. So again, I think the big question of what PCTV should be, what services it should be providing is the first question to answer, and then what infrastructure is required to make that happen would be a follow-up consideration.
Okay. And again, that master plan is already funded in the 2022-2023 budget cycle, so we wouldn't be adding that on to our next year's budget. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah.
Okay. How much is that amount?
Our recollection is it's between 30 and 50,000, but we can get back to you. And that would be itemized. So another question came up about looking at the budget detail. This baseline budget summary is very high level. When you first see the preliminary proposed budget, it will look, more or less exactly like the adopted budget, which has the number of positions in each department, all of the contract costs and everything like that. So that all that detail, including what is budgeted for the PCTV master plan, will be itemized.
Okay, gotcha. And just because we're on the topic, if it is not an infrastructure assessment, I'm wondering about the consideration of the franchise fees that go to it. Are we, with the master plan, give consideration or assessment of how we spend those fees?
Yeah.
Okay.
So the master plan would look at what PCTV should be doing in the future and how it would fund those operations. So the consideration of the different revenue sources would be part of that.
Okay. I want to, it seems like $30,000 is a pretty hefty expense. So I'm glad that we funded that in this past year cycle. I do want to, if possible, let us look at like what that master plan scope would entail. I've heard some challenges around just like the infrastructure side of it. So I do think that that could be something we look to as a capital improvement plan. Particularly, again, like we do have different facilities. We also are building new facilities across the city. So just if we were to expand this or just even enhance PCTV, I think we may want to look at perhaps opportunities to think about infrastructure as well as operations. And I don't want to come back to a master plan 5 years later and miss that mark. So if we can just, again, like align ourselves in that, I think it would make me a little bit more comfortable if that's okay. But again, thank you for also prioritizing that in this last year's budget cycle. I think that's really exciting that we're moving forward with that. My next question I wanted to ask was around the library modernization. So that's not a project currently. I just made that up on the spot as a name. But I do know, and I've made an announcement around how the county's working to get library improvements in this next year, which will also result into transitioning of the deed of the library facility to the city, to city ownership. At that same time, I also know there's been a number of requests publicly that have not been moved into the CIP process yet around improvements to that area, addressing some of the issues around unhoused folks that perhaps live in that area, trash capture, that kind of issue, as well as just the issue of the facility itself, which right now is the county. But I'm wondering if there has been consideration as those conversations move forward of how we might leverage our spending power as a city to improve that library facility holistically. That could mean, for example, increasing the level of the library. Right now, it's a one-story library. Perhaps working with the county as we develop these improvements to consider other options, and then also if there had. In addition, have there been any questions around like new funding mechanisms in that that consideration? Again, I know it's not in the CIP yet, but that's something that our city's working on. So is that something that you all have considered?
No, we haven't considered that. Okay. So we, city staff will have a follow-up conversation. So the news that the county intends to transfer the ownership of the library to the city sometime in 2024 was news to city staff. And so we have a meeting scheduled with county staff to discuss what that is going to look like in the coming weeks. Okay. And after which we'll have a better sense of the timeline. We suggested that the city create a facilities and real estate master plan, which we don't really have. I think that the library would be included as part of that. And so the question of whether that facility particularly needs to be renovated would be covered in that facilities master plan. We have already pointed out to the consultants who are working on the parks master plan that they consider that area around the library in the parks master plan. There are some picnic tables there. There's a native plant garden. It's also kind of the termination of that creekside path on the other side of Pinole Valley Road. So there might be some recommendations for improving that area that come out of the park master plan.
Okay, thank you. And then just a last question about one of the considerations that we talked about in our last CIP was around the on-call, the need for on-call services for capital projects. Can you tell us about how that process has gone in this last year, given that we've approved that appropriation? Can you tell us about how that process has gone? Have you all used that budget fully for these projects? And which projects have received money for that?
For the last year, the on-call services, what we have used is mostly on the design, some of the roads design works, road CIP projects, and all of the projects were actually went through a RFP process and not through on-call services. On-call services mostly for smaller projects. I can give you an example for the Tenant Avenue improvement for the Pear and Plum that went through a on-call service. I'm working to the same consultant for Pinole Middle School, a conceptual plan development, and there was some help we obtained for grant applications that we prepared to prepare some sketches for that, and some similar work. All other works are mostly bid out with a proper RFP and proper evaluation. The total dollar amount, I can't tell you from top of my head, but if you need that information, we can find how much dollar we spent for on-call services.
Thank you. Can you give that report back in the next, when this comes back to our council? That one. And then the reason I ask that is I wonder, when we develop partnerships with other cities, whether it's a wastewater treatment plant, I know that's more in the form of a JPA or MOU. I also wonder if you all have a history lesson on the dispatch services. How did that program become to be? Was that something that City of Pinole initiated? The dispatch services we just talked about, is that something that the City of Pinole initiated?
I actually don't know the history, but I think we have someone who might know the history. So if you want to talk about that further, Chief Gang, if you would.
Hello.
I'm sorry, could you just repeat the question one more time?
Yeah, so I spoke to, I'm asking a question around some of our partnerships. So one of the partnerships we have where we kind of share some of the revenue and expenditures includes the wastewater treatment plant. What I'm hearing is also we have a great partnership with the city of Hercules and San Pablo and maybe other cities around dispatch services for our police department. And we tend to have it seems like it's a really great partnership in that we're not expending extra funds. It's being managed well, and we come back to the table several times to continue that contract. What's the history behind that contract? How did that how did that partnership become?
Yeah, so there was a West County consortium, and we were all doing, we had our own dispatch center at the time, but we were doing all records management and CAD services through Richmond. That plan, that relationship fell apart several years ago, and that time is when we made the suggestion of we had a lack of capacity to do RMS and CAD here. So we made the suggestion of coming into a tri-city agreement with San Pablo and Hercules to offer dispatch services at that time. And then in conjunction, San Pablo would handle the RMS CAD services for us. So that was something that we initiated. The chiefs at that time initiated that suggestion. It actually stemmed from this organization as a tri-city model. And it was something that we sought partnerships with those two other agencies at that time. We have historically dispatched for Hercules for many years, and then adding San Pablo with the opportunities we were, I guess, experiencing the situation in Richmond opened that opportunity to bring on San Pablo as another dispatch partner.
Okay. Yeah, Chief, thank you. No, that's super helpful. I want to, and if you all don't mind staying with me on this, I'm connecting that idea to Public Works, because what I'm hearing as a council member is that we have a large amount of projects that we want to do, and I think we have some challenges with getting those projects done because of both the people that we have, right, and sometimes not having enough people, but also the funding, which is also a problem, I'm sure, for other cities. So I'm wondering, has our city looked into perhaps with some of these projects, especially like the striping or things like that, have we looked to working with the city of Hercules and creating an MOU similar to our dispatch program or the county public works department? And again, like aligning this need for, perhaps unionized labor as well as like getting the job done. Have we considered those partnerships with these agencies for public works? Thank you, Chief. Your offering around the history is important to know how that was brought up, because I'm connecting. I would like to know how we can do that in public works as well.
Yeah, I appreciate the opportunity to speak on that. Just small agencies, a regional approach is sometimes more beneficial.
Sure.
Certainly in this environment, partnering together in the collaboration and partnership made us all a little bit stronger than trying to go about this ourselves with the limited funding and resources that we had.
That's great to know. Yeah. So City Manager Murray or Director Mishra, is that something we've considered or opportunities to explore?
I don't recall us having explored. I don't recall having heard mention of us exploring it in the past. But this falls under an umbrella of arrangements we called shared services, which is pretty common. And in fact, it's within the scope of the consultants that are going to be working on the long-term financial plan to do kind of a high-level assessment of whether those opportunities exist for Pinole. And I think importantly, the crux of it is are there efficiencies from doing it, from scaling it up, because that's not the case for everything, but it might be for certain service areas. So in addition to hearing what the consulting firm Baker Tilly says when they do their assessment, we're happy to have us look at that separately. The Public Works team and the City Manager's office look at whether there are any opportunities for shared services in some of the Public Works maintenance functions.
Okay.
I don't think that we're going to be able to complete a thorough analysis of that in time for incorporation into this budget process, but we might be able to. I think we could get it done mid-fiscal year, and then the City Council could decide whether we want to pursue it further.
What would it take to at least give us a recommendation of the projects that could be aligned that way? even if it's not a formal decision point that we make. I'm just wondering, there's so many projects here that.
So I don't think any of the capital projects would lend themselves to that. I think our regular operations and maintenance projects might lend themselves to that.
Okay.
And so that would be in the operating budget. I mean, so it would require having a initial exploratory conversation with the other organizations. It means that somebody is willing to shoulder the responsibility for serving in that coordinating capacity, which we don't happen to know with the peer agencies. So I think the first step would be finding out from those other organizations whether they're interested in pursuing this discussion further. And that's something we could report back on when we next discuss the budget.
Okay. And is there currently, I know with the assistant to the city manager, is that a current role within intergovernmental, the responsibility of intergovernmental communication? Is that process starting there? I mean, that's...
Yeah, although that's different. That I think that intergovernmental relations role has more to do with legislative matters and funding matters, not so much service models. This would be something that the public works directors and the city managers would discuss, and so we're happy to have that conversation.
Okay, great, thank you. I think that's all my questions. Are there any? Yes, Councilmember Teague.
I just wanted to ask. I brought up that. When the city manager put out that call for projects to go out, I brought out community gardening and the that urban tilth, like growing vegetables and stuff. I think it's at Richmond. Yeah, North Richmond. They have a few areas that grow food for the community. And I don't know if, and I know that Richmond, I think, it donates to it. It's a nonprofit. And having a community garden as I don't know if that would fit into the capital plan. I mentioned it, I think, last time, and sent some information to the city manager to explore. Maybe if there's more information to potentially turn into a CIP project. I'm not sure if it belongs there or if it's an operational thing.
So I think it would be a capital project just based on, kind of thresholds and costs. It's the park master plan will be looking into that. If for some reason the city council wants to act on it more quickly, so as we said, the parks master plan isn't going to be completed until the end of this calendar year. I suppose it's possible that we could cost and look at the feasibility of doing a standalone community garden assessment.
There's an estimate, I think it'd be great to have just
cost estimate.
Yeah, just for long term. I mean, probably shouldn't be something too difficult to research and find out, like per square foot, and then we just scale from there to get something down as far as estimating goes.
Sure. So we can come back at the next meeting with some rough figure, kind of a scope, a schedule, a budget for a community garden.
Okay. And I just remembered the conversation we had about the paving truck was like 2 years ago, and we were talking about lending it to Hercules, and that was kind of along the lines, and we talked about maybe having an MOU and shared resources, but that seemed like at that time it was like way over what the capacity we had to do. But Mayor Murphy, you mentioned it, and then I started thinking, I think we talked about that, but we kind of shelved it for a while. But it might be worth it to have that conversation and figure out what that looks like, because I know that we borrowed their bucket truck too at that time. I think we needed to change lights or something like that. It was during Joe's. I don't know if we have the minutes back on it, but there was some discussion about shared resources and how we might be able to afford one piece of equipment and Hercules might be able to afford another, and try to use some kind of sharing model there. So I don't know if that helps, but
I recall that conversation. So we will find a way to wrap that into the budget dialogue. It's an operating budget issue. When we do share equipment, they use our vacuum truck for sewer system related things. Yes.
Thank you. Mayor Pro Tem Thomas.
I just wanted to bring up, there's a lot of good ideas coming out of with the discussions of the capital improvement plan. And I just wanted to point out that we're currently working on our climate action plan that will have some actions associated with it that could be like the urban garden, the tree planting plan, that sort of thing. And then I'm aware of there is a group of staff, city and county, that get together and discuss sustainability issues, and they have had some discussions about doing plans that cover a wider area. For instance, a tree planting plan, you're going to want to know what species, and that's going to be the same for all of West County. And then you get more specific, as far as for each city where those would be located. So there are some opportunities, and I would just encourage us to do that. The Urban Tilth Project, that had Measure WW East Bay Mud funds, it had park dedication funds, and it had land donated.
So Mayor Pro Tem Toms, if you don't mind me asking, how can we support our staff in moving some of these? Because I think, something that comes to me, and the reason I think about these shared services, or what I hear as the term shared services, outside of our dispatch program, which seems like it's been an amazing partnership. Again, the Contra Costa County's IRA conference is coming up, and that really stemmed from some of the small cities in Contra Costa not being able to benefit from federal ledge. But it's an opportunity, again, for folks to have that kind of consortium. Is there?
I think that there's those ideas. There's the county public works directors and the city managers meet, the sustainability staff meet, and then you have like WICTAC. One of the things that we have in common with Rodeo, Hercules, Pinole, and San Pablo is that we have the planning area, the priority development zone along San Pablo Avenue. So it makes sense that if there's projects that we're looking at for along that stretch, that we already have an MOU, that we presented ourselves, San Pablo Avenue corridor to ABAG to have a special designation, and we've committed to doing higher density all along that roadway. So there are some really good, there's framework already for those areas.
Thank you. All right. Any other comments or motions? Or yes, Councilmember Martinez-Rubin.
Thank you. Just one little detail additional to the suggested projects that I mentioned earlier, particular to the creek, is that there be a category specific to pedestrian trails. I talked to city manager some time ago about this because right now we don't have such a thing. I'm looking at slide number 5, budget summary for the CIP, and they're not quite streets and roads. They're not quite parks. So, and not quite facilities. So if you would consider having the additional category, somehow it can highlight for future attention, whether it be for operations or for seeking funding sources.
We'll think about how to find a place for those in the CIP. The magnitude and cost of many of those projects is smaller than some of the other projects, and so whether it makes sense to have it serve as a standalone category, we'll give that some thought and address that, our recommendation for that as part of the preliminary proposed CIP.
I'll also like to add, in terms of our trails, some of the complete streets projects that we've mentioned, now that we're in contract for our active transportation plan, we'll likely see some of these projects you've already mentioned. And a while ago, we did apply for TDA funding to pave some of the multi-purpose trails along the creek. But the issues that we faced were a portion of the the trail is not owned by the city. So there are some challenges around that, which I think the park master plan will address, as well as our active transportation plan.
Thank you, and thanks for mentioning that. And so I'm thinking about how thinking evolves about what either merits attention as a public project or funding, and also where agencies find that they're compatible to work on similar projects. So if we're talking about the flood control district, for example, it may be time to have a conversation with them about what their interests are, what their priorities are. So I think that's the agency that we have to work with. I was going to say contend with, but whose jurisdiction somehow affects what decisions are made about work alongside the creek. I understand that. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. I'm not seeing any other hands from the council, so if you all can just give us a quick recap of the key takeaways for this item, that'd be helpful. Yeah.
Okay, so I'll just give a recap of what I have, and then Director Mishra can add. We'll be coming back with potential projects that could be funded through the various grant opportunities that are available. We will provide an update on our requests to legislature for funding for the Fernandez Park project, as well as the Senior Center parking lot upgrade. We will provide more information on project requests that we've heard from you all tonight. And then we will also be incorporating projects from our various master plans into the unfunded project list. And for the projects that kind of are defined in terms of providing a cost estimate for a community garden or a cost estimate for doing preliminary engineering design for San Pablo Avenue complete streets, we'll be providing those estimates as informational items for the in preparation of the proposed preliminary master plan.
Okay, thank you. Director Mishra?
We will also provide some information regarding some of the items which are preventive maintenance in operations or in the CIP. And once we have a discussion with the county regarding the library facility, we may include that as part of our facility master plan. We'll provide some information regarding the total cost we have spent on on-call services last year. We'll give some thought to the shared services with other cities, which could be folded into one of the memos we will counsel. We will discuss, and this is probably for future, this is regarding the climate action in urban gardening, but that would be just a discussion, so there's nothing to come back there. And we will give some thought to how to include the pedestrian trails as a separate category.
All right, thank you. Are there anything that council feels like it's missing for direction from that? Councilmember Tafe?
I just wanted to ask a quick question. So the urban garden, we're going to be coming back with some general costs, right? Like, I mean, ROM numbers, like, just on, okay. Just rough order magnitude numbers for that. The item number 4, it was 200,000. Was that for the generator? I know it's in the first presentation. It was like emergency power for critical failure.
So we were waiting on the emergency operations plan to identify our critical facilities, and then the remaining 30,000 was initially programmed to kind of do an assessment, and then the remainder 170,000 is in the case that we need to have a generator or some other mechanism.
Okay.
That's what that was for.
And just in general, the building's master plan is really going to drive like which buildings are prioritized for improvement and all that stuff, right?
Yes.
And that's including the climate and the energy usage and all of that, right? Okay. And that report's not coming till January, or is it?
Right. Where the facilities master plan will be and real estate master plan will be a proposed CIP project that comes forward in the preliminary proposed CIP, and so that's not even scheduled. The parks master plan will be completed by the end of this calendar year, but the facilities master plan will be later than that.
So, I mean, I know we talked about this before, and I hate to kind of go back to, but we talked about roofing. Like, I remember this conversation where we were talking about tiny tots and the water and, you know, all that a while back, right? Is that all incorporated into the CIP too?
That would be part of the facilities master plan.
Okay, so what we did was saw the volume and said, okay, let's step back and get a consultant to come in and kind of line all this stuff up.
Yeah, it's also important for our long-term planning. So we don't have a long-term replacement schedule that we can factor into something like the long-term financial plan.
Okay, so the theory was to take a step back, look at it as a whole.
Holistically.
Yeah, and then got it. All right. And then attach dollars to it and then long-term planning. Got it. Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm. So just to clarify, there are two staff recommendations coming back for the CIP. One is the tree mitigation, but the second is the building and real estate master plan. And those are both infrastructure assessments? Because the report on page 6 just says add tree mitigation project for $50,000, but it...
Yeah, so the presentation talked about the tree mitigation, but then staff has had internal conversation as we're developing our capital improvement plan, and that is another project that would be... The tree master plan is a separate effort from the tree mitigation.
I understand, but the presentation on slide 6 just says that we're adding the tree mitigation plan for $50,000. It doesn't reference I know because we've talked about it before, the building and real estate master plan, but it doesn't reference that. So I'm wondering if that's going to be added. What I hear is that it's going to be added next.
Yes.
But how much is that?
So what we're going to do, we think the annual amount is going to be $50,000, but we're still assessing the damages from the storm that we've had, and by the time we come back to you, we'll have an amount for that damage, and then once we go ahead and repair that damage, we will seek reimbursement through FEMA.
Okay. And then the building and real estate master plan, what's the estimation on that?
$200,000.
$200,000. And where is that coming from?
We have not made a decision on that. We'd have to get together with finance to determine an appropriate funding source for that.
Okay. So what I would hear that it wouldn't come from the general fund, because if it did for this year, it would be an additional, it would make that baseline deficit $600,000.
So the baseline deficit is just your ongoing things. It's not capital projects.
Gotcha.
So, and that something like the facilities master plan would come from our fund balance. And so that's a fine use of fund balance. It's one-time resources for one-time funds.
Gotcha. Thank you. Of course, Councilmember Taylor.
So we are doing short-term mitigation measures, though. I think that we did talk about that before. Is that include
For the trees or facilities?
Facilities?
Yeah, there are all sorts of, there's a citywide roofing project and all sorts of other things, yeah.
Okay.
So nothing that is, presents the risk of diminishing the value of the asset significantly is being put on hold while we do a master plan. We're doing addressing all sorts of pressing needs while we're also developing these master plans.
Got it. So we would do a roof patch rather than the full roof, knowing that we need the full roof.
Yes, or if it was economically advantageous, we'd do a re-roof. If something is sitting in front of us that obviously needs to be done, we're not going to wait for a master plan to tell us it needs to be done. So we'll proceed with those, and those things are in the proposed CIP.
Okay. I'm just wondering, as those grants come out, will it accelerate any of those projects? But I guess we'll see. Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you. Any other comments, questions, motions? If not, thank you again for your presentation. We are, that was the last item of new business tonight, and we are now ready to adjourn. So I thank you, staff, for all the questions that you've answered. Thank you to the public for being here, for your comments, and of course, thank you to council for the work that you do to make these things happen. So we will now, we're now ready to adjourn, and we'll adjourn to the regular meeting of the City Council of April 29th in remembrance of Amber Swartz. Good evening, everyone.